All right, welcome everybody. This is the second informal workshop for the AB 901 rulemaking process. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Robert Carlson. I'm a supervisor in the policy office at CalRecycle and running the rulemaking process. We have Christine Hironaka here to my right. She's our director of the policy. We have Paulina Lawrence to my left from our enforcement office, and Ilanka Zledar from the policy office as well. I'm going to walk us through part of the workshop. The presentation was posted, so hopefully a lot of you had an opportunity to print that out. If you didn't, there should be a few copies out in the lobby along with some of the agendas. The agenda for today, I'm going to briefly go over some opening remarks, and then I will go section by section through the draft regulatory language. The draft regulatory language was posted on our website about 2 weeks ago, maybe 2.5 weeks at this point, and was also sent out via the AB 901 listserv. So hopefully a lot of you had an opportunity to look at that draft language and know what these sections are about, but I'll give a brief overview of each section and then walk through some of the areas that we feel we need particular feedback on. And then we'll close with an opportunity for questions and comments. We'll also pause briefly at the end of each section for questions and comments from the audience. I think the easiest way is for folks to come up to the podium mic just up here. We have 2 of them, so folks can sort of line up and we'll take you one at a time to ask your questions or provide comments. And then again, at the end, we'll have time for either broader comments or if we wanted to go back and touch on some of the sections from earlier. So AB 901 reporting is an expansion of our existing disposal reporting system. And really we're hoping that this will help CalRecycle and the state of California achieve our 75% goal in 2020. We're hoping that this will help us by providing more information about the statewide disposal, recycling, and composting infrastructure that will allow us to more accurately target projects as we move forward so that we're making the best use of all of our time and money. And we can only know that how best to utilize that time and money if we know what's going on in the industry, where materials are flowing and where there's the most potential for improvement. So that being said, some of you may already be fairly familiar with 901, but for those who aren't, I'll give a very brief overview. AB 901 was signed in 2015, really to update and streamline the disposal reporting procedures. We're moving into an online-only reporting system, utilizing current technology to hopefully reduce the amount of time it takes for reporting to occur and to minimize errors. There's also going to be a shift away from facilities reporting to counties and then counties reporting to CalRecycle. And now most facilities are going to be reporting directly to CalRecycle. We're hoping this will improve the data quality and quantity by expanding the reporting facilities beyond just disposal into recycling and composting, removing the inherent errors that come from manual data input. And as I said, help CalRecycle further its mandates of 75% as well as the mandatory commercial recycling and mandatory organics recycling. The rulemaking process that we're engaged in here, I'll go very briefly over that whole process as well. The first part that we're in the middle of right now is the informal workshops. We hold these meetings to gain feedback from the regulated community. It helps us better understand the issues, and when the formal rulemaking process begins, ultimately it helps the process go more smoothly and we end up with a regulatory package that is easier to understand and more accurately reflects the realities of the industry that it's regulating. Once these are done, we will move into the formal rulemaking process, which is governed by the Office of Administrative Law. This has very strict timelines, procedures, and comment periods, and there will be quite a number of those comment periods throughout the process where the public will have an opportunity to look at and review draft regulatory language and provide comments, and CalRecycle will take those comments and respond to them. We are hoping to begin the formal process this fall. The exact timing is still not known. We want to make sure that we're being responsive through these informal workshops. So we're hoping to take the comments and questions that we get from these workshops and determine whether it will be necessary to have another informal workshop before we move into the formal rulemaking process. The formal rulemaking process takes about a year, and so we're hoping to be done right around the middle or sort of last part of 2017. All of this is in hopes of having the online reporting system developed and ready to go by the end of 2017, with the first reporting period being the first quarter of 2018. So this flowchart, don't expect anybody to read all of it. This is essentially the information flow of the old or existing disposal reporting system that folks are participating in now. You can see there's a lot of information going back and forth and sort of around and around, ultimately making it to counties who then submit the information to CalRecycle. The major changes that AB 901 have made are that the facilities are going to now report directly to CalRecycle rather than being filtered through their counties. We're also going to be expanding the reporting requirements to include recycling and composting operations, as well as transporters, exporters, and brokers who have not all historically been required to report under the old DRS system. We're also going to be moving into a mandatory online reporting system, whereas in the past it's been a little bit all over the place, where we have received some digital submissions as well as some on paper, and this will add some consistency and reliability to the reporting. And then lastly, this new change for providing authority to CalRecycle for enforcement and civil penalties hasn't been something that CalRecycle has had the authority for in the past. But moving forward, it should provide a lot higher quality data being submitted on time, and we can rely on the data a little bit more than we've been able to in some cases in the past. So the new system, I guess it still looks a little bit confusing, but part of that's because, as we all know, the waste management, recycling, and composting world is a complex system. And as you see here, there are lots of facilities that are going to be reporting to CalRecycle, from haulers to recyclers, brokers, transfer station, MRFs, and disposal facilities. Some of those facilities will also be reporting to each other depending on the particulars, and we'll go over those situations as we move through the presentation. And then ultimately, the information that is received and compiled by CalRecycle, some of which will be provided to the jurisdictions for their reporting purposes, and some of it will be made available to the public. Obviously, though, we will be keeping confidential business information confidential. So before we move on to the first section of the regulations, do we have any questions or comments about the overall purpose of the bill, or some of the first pieces of information that we've gone over, some of the changes from the existing system? Come on up to the front. We've got a couple of people, I think, moving their way down. Whoever gets here first can go first. And if you just say your name and who you're affiliated with, so those who are listening online know who's speaking.
My name is Tom Davis with Davis Consulting Services. based here in Orange County. My broad question is how, in your mind, AB 901 relates to the Waste Stream Reduction Act, setting goals for different municipalities to meet certain percentage reduction. Can you speak to that a little bit, please?
Sure, I can speak a little bit to that. So the new DDRS system will serve as a tool, an information gathering tool that will help inform the local assistance and market development branch, who really are the ones who work with the local jurisdictions for that. So this will be an opportunity to gather data to help inform the data analysis group in the local assistance branch, and working with their jurisdictions to get that information.
Dan Noble, Association of Compost Producers. I had a question about the material that never isn't picked up by a hauler, whether it's self-haul, but more importantly, any waste reduction prior to entering the solid waste system. How is that going to be accounted for in 901, or is that accounted for some other way?
You know, I might ask that you give a little bit more specific example, so that I can.
Let's say we have a food processor or even like a food bank that just became a member of our association that does on-site composting, and instead of, and that's 2 tons a day of material, and that is no longer being hauled off-site, going to a landfill. It's being composted in an in-vessel compost process on-site. And so are they now a composter that is not receiving material because they're doing, I don't know how they would be classified or if they're even included in this system in terms of
Sure.
waste reduction approaches.
Sure.
That's just being one of many ways.
So, you know, there are a number of sort of exemptions built into the draft language that are either based on size, throughput kind of thing. So there may be an exemption for that particular example because of the size of the operation. The source of the material is a bit less important than what is going on at the facility and what's coming out of the facility. So if a facility is composting material and does not fall into one of the exemptions for throughput, and they're sending off-site finished compost, then they likely would fall into the category of a composter and be required to report. We can go into greater detail when we get further down the road in the presentation, when we talk specifically about either the thresholds for reporting or the reporting categories for recyclers or composters. But yeah, for the most part, in the example that you gave, it seems like they would likely be a reporting entity unless they were too small to reach the threshold for reporting.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, well, nobody else has come up, so we will move on to the next, the first section of the regulations, which is the registration, reporting, and exemptions. Now, this is the section that's meant to apply to everybody. So these are some general pieces that help explain what kinds of information a reporting entity would have to report, when, how often, and then explain some of the exemptions. Oh, sorry, we've got a comment from John Sitz online, so I'll have Alanka read that.
So I'm talking on behalf of John Sitz. And he says that generally source reduction is going to be out. So if it's reduced on site and is, you know, not therefore going into the waste stream, and then it would probably be out of the regulations. So yeah, I mean, if you have a recycling and composting operation that's not excluded based on our definitions, then they would have to report. But if they are within the excluded categories, which are matching the compost regulations that came out earlier, was it last year? then you would not have to report.
Great. Thank you. So for registration and exemptions, the first bullet, if you're, you have to register with the system that we will be assigning numbers for the disposal and diversion reporting system, or the DDRS system as we're calling it. There are some exemptions, as I mentioned. The first are compost operations that meet the exemption requirements of the new composting regulations, as Alonka just mentioned. You can see the reference there. If an operation is small, and this one's a little bit confusing perhaps, so I'll try to walk folks through it. If you're small, meaning you handle no more than 10 tons of recyclable materials or solid waste in a reporting period, in a quarter, if you never do that, if you never handle more than 10 tons, then you don't have to register, you don't get a number, you don't report, you're out. If you periodically handle more than 10 tons, then the first time that you do handle more than 10 tons in a quarter, you have to report and get a number. So register and then report for that quarter. And then in subsequent quarters, if your handling amount drops below the 10-ton threshold, for 6 quarters, you have to simply report that you are under 10 tons. And then you're out for the rest of the reporting requirements. But if you jump back up over the 10-ton limit during those quarters, or at any time after that, then you'll have to report again, and it'll start that 6-quarter clock again. And then end users are not required to register or to report. And you'll see in the draft regulations there is a definition of end users. And we've gone back and forth about this. For those of you who were at this meeting, the last meeting a number of weeks ago, there was some discussion about what constitutes an end user and who is and who is not an end user. And the definition that we came up with, I think does a pretty good job of explaining what we mean. But you'll see that it defines it as the users of a material that significantly resemble a virgin material or as a homogeneous material like compost or mulch. So the end users for, say, organics material would be the users of compost, the users of mulch as mulch or for direct land application. For paper, it would be something like paper pulp. Recycled paper pulp significantly resembles virgin paper pulp. The same thing for metals, iron, aluminum, ingots, rods, sheets, etc. The users of that material would be end users and therefore not subject to the reporting. Anybody up to that point would be a reporting entity. And then the reports to the department, they're all electronic through the DDRS system. It specifies that you must include the name, address, and DDRS number of the reporting entity, so that's you if you're a reporting entity, and the same information for the receiving person. The receiving entity's information will be kept confidential, and only aggregated information would be made public. And we know that a lot of facilities are concerned about making confidential customer lists available to the public, and that is not the intent. One of the big reasons that we need this information is so that we have an opportunity to identify reporting entities. So if you're sending it to somebody, it should not be your duty to know whether that is a reporting entity or not. You tell us who you sent it to, and then we check up and follow up with that entity to determine whether they need to be reporting to us as well. We talked a lot at the last workshop in Sacramento about the days, the reporting time, and we'd like to have that conversation with the folks here as well. What we're trying to do with the reporting period is because some entities will be required to wait for other entities to report to them before they can finalize their report. We're looking to have a staggered reporting timeframe with the haulers, which we'll talk about later, reporting first, then the facilities that report to disposal facilities, and then lastly, the disposal facilities being the last ones in the reporting line, essentially. We also have a few things in the Merson transfer station section that should make it a little easier for disposal facilities to report more quickly. So while we do have numbers here, we want to have some conversation with folks in the room to see what is a reasonable time period for reporting this information. And then for facilities that have, for recycling and composting facilities that have at a single location more than one operation type, so you might have a mulching operation and a composting operation that are on the same site but essentially function as independent operations, those can be aggregated into one report. One thing that we do need a little bit of thought about from folks is how do we identify what constitutes a single site? Whether it's a physical address, if they're just by addresses, or if we look at whether the different parts of the facility can be accessed using private roads only, or if you need to access a public road to go in between them, then there's two different sites. We've talked a little bit about that internally, but obviously we need some expertise from folks in the industry to let us know what makes sense in that area. So who has to report? Anyone handling materials in these categories must report. So things like the commodity recyclables, traditional things like paper, plastic, glass, metal, as well as organics recycling, which would be anything that deals with organics that doesn't fall into the category of composting. So things like chipping and grinding for mulch or direct land application would be an example of organics recycling. Construction and demolition and inerts. There are some targeted products that we would like to track as well, including white goods, carpet, mattresses, furniture, electronics, textiles, household batteries, architectural paint, and used tires. Although I think used tires slipped in there. But anyway, the list of targeted products is again something we'd like some conversation about. When we looked at the statutory language, it's pretty broad. It basically just says recycling and composting with no real limits specified. We want to get as much information as we can that will be useful for our purposes without, one, making it onerous on the reporting entities, or two, duplicating reporting for materials that are already well reported as is. So as we went through some of the materials out there, a number of them fell out because we feel that they are being tracked fairly well already, things like used oil, but others could use additional tracking, better information to know where those materials are flowing in the system, and this is the list that we came up with. We'd like your thoughts on this list as well. And then also mixed materials, so mixed recyclable or compostable materials, or mixed solid waste. So recycling and composting operations sometimes do handle mixed materials. We are distinguishing between a category of quote-unquote mixed recyclables and compostables versus mixed solid waste using the 10% threshold for residuals. So if you've got more than 10%, then we call it mixed solid waste. Less than 10%, we call it mixed recyclables or compostables. It has to be reported regardless. It's just a matter of what it's being called. That threshold, that 10%, is certainly up for discussion as well if there is another number that is meaningful or makes sense based on your knowledge and experience. And then how the information is being reported. So if you are handling paper, you have to report. But what do you tell us? So if materials leaving your facility, what information do you need to report, at what level of detail. And what we're saying is that the material type must be reported at the level it was sold or transferred. So as a couple of examples to continue on with paper, if what you're sending out of your facility is mixed paper, you report mixed paper. We're not going to require a facility to do a survey and find out how much of that mixed bale is cardboard versus newsprint versus white ledger. It's mixed paper. But if you are sending out a bale that is OCC, you report OCC. If you send out a bale that's newsprint, you report newsprint, and so on. For plastics, if it's mixed plastics, just report it as mixed plastics. But if it's a PET bale, report it as PET. What we're trying to do here is get the best information that we can, again, while not requiring facilities to do additional work. We don't want facilities to have to break into all of their bales and sort and do all of that kind of extra work. We just want to know what's actually leaving those facilities. And that was the last point for the first section on general requirements, reporting requirements. We'll take a break for some questions and comments now, if there are any in the room, or if there are any that have come in online, we'll take those as well. Okay, while we've got someone walking up, can you ask the first question from online?
Yeah, there's a couple questions about the source sector. Did you want to address that now or after we talk about it more?
We'll talk about source sector a little bit later, so why don't we hold off on that right now, and then we'll talk about source sector later.
Come on up to both mics, folks. Thanks.
Cynthia Van Tol, Mariposa Eco Consulting. We have a city that has a large grocery chain, and they have a digester, and all this material from all their stores is going there. They're burning it up, and there's roll-offs and roll-offs of residual. They're permitted. They're not permitted as a solid waste facility. And so how is that going to work?
Right, so the reporting requirements won't be tied to permit status. Permitted facilities and non-permitted facilities will have to report under the 901 regulations. Not knowing the details of how this facility is operating, I can't say exactly, but if it doesn't fall in one of the exemption categories for either under the organics, the composting regulations, or because of the amount of material that they're processing in a quarter, then they would likely be a reporting entity and would have to report essentially as a composter if they fall into that category.
Okay, and there's going to be staff, because right now we have a problem where this poor city is taking all the residual, and they're working hard to meet that per capita. So, I mean, this is a good thing for us because this is what we wanted, but we want to make sure that that does happen.
Sure, yeah, if they are in fact a reporting entity.
They're not a reporting entity because their permit does not allow them to do that yet. They're
Well,
not permitted.
The permit wouldn't really be a determining factor on whether
Right.
they're a reporting entity for 901. So they may
Right.
well be not permitted or not need a permit and still have to report
Okay.
as a reporting entity for 901. So if they are a reporting entity under the regulations for 901, then as a composting facility, what they would have to report is the recycled or the composted materials that they send out of their facility, whatever those materials might be, and all of the material that they send to disposal would have to be reported to the disposal facility that they send it to, along with jurisdiction of origin for that residual material.
Yeah, I'm supporting that 100%.
Great.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Yes, this is Tom Davis, Davis Consulting Services. The current existing Swiss process for certain waste disposal sites, how will the DDRS affect what folks do in reporting through the Swiss system?
I don't believe that there will be any impacts on Swiss reporting from 901 requirements for reporting. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add on that, but I don't believe
So
that
it
there
doesn't
would be.
replace it?
This is not a replacement for any other reporting except for the existing DRS reporting. So the existing or old DRS reporting system will in fact go away, and be replaced with the DDRS, but all other reporting requirements, both to CalRecycle or to local jurisdictions that are in place, those would all be left unchanged.
Okay. Is this the appropriate time to make a comment or two on the definitions in the draft regulations?
I think that this would be a good opportunity for that if it pertains to some of the initial discussion. If it's specific to, say, a transporter or exporter or broker or something that we'll talk about later in the presentation, maybe we'll hold off on that.
Sounds fair. I refer you to definition 17, which is end user. You've mentioned that a couple times.
Yep.
And I think I understand the intent of that term. I want to suggest, though, that to make it clear to a lot of the constituents in this room and elsewhere, that we consider adding under 17A, under your such as category, 2 or 3 other examples, if you don't mind. I would offer that you would place there as an example, source-separated concrete and asphalt. And I'll get back to why I think these should. Asphalt grindings. Recycled asphalt product, wrap. And returned concrete, ready-mix concrete. Now, what do all of those things have in common? These things, like the other examples that are listed here, are used to make, in part, a final product by an end user. For example, an asphalt plant that would take in grindings or wrap, by law, through Caltrans specifications and other agencies, can put a certain percentage of that into their material. This wrap and grindings are homogeneous. They're essentially the same as the virgin material. And that is implemented, introduced to virgin material, if you will, use that term, to make a final product. And so I think using that as an example, another example is return concrete, although not as common as using wrap and grindings. It's becoming more and more important from the green aspect of our society to use more of that in ready-mix concrete that is a final product and end user. Again, that material resembles the virgin material, serves the same purpose, and it's homogeneous. Same thing for the source-separated concrete and asphalt. That is a small subset of what you've been using here as a much broader term, and that is construction, demolition, and inert material. How this is different, the source separated, you understand the term, of concrete and asphalt that doesn't have any other construction demolition material in it, no lumber, no plastic, no lost tools, none of that stuff, is taken to an inert debris recycling center as defined in Title 14, Article 5.90, and is turned into crushed miscellaneous base, which is a final product and made by an end user to a specification, either Caltrans or a Green Book specification. So, in summary, I would like you to strongly suggest that you add those 4 terms as further examples for clarification and intent in the definition of end user.
Thank you. I'll add a few of my thoughts. knowing fairly little about this particular sector, I'll see if my understanding is correct. But so definitely, I think that we're getting close to sort of a similar understanding of the definition for end user. So I think in the situation where somebody is using aggregate that's derived from concrete, say, I think in that situation, we're talking about Caltrans, or we're talking about the construction company who is buying those 80 yards of concrete-derived aggregate to use as road base or for other construction purposes. So that person would certainly not be required to report because they would be an end user. But the entity right up the stream, the one who crushes the concrete and creates the product that resembles a virgin product, would be a reporting entity, because they're taking a raw feedstock, the concrete, and they're crushing it, processing it, and then selling it on to an end user. They themselves are not the end user because they're not using it, they're processing it and selling it to somebody else who would use it. So in that case, the crusher would be a reporting entity, and the user, the construction company or the Caltrans or whomever else is using it, would be the end user, because they are the ones who are in fact using the material.
Well, I disagree with that analysis or understanding of the term. And not to belabor this, but it's very important for our industry. Why don't you take another one of those examples like metal ingots and go through the same thought process?
Right, so a MRF that separates aluminum cans would be a reporting entity.
Right?
The smelter who is melting those cans down would be a reporting entity. If they sell ingots or rods or sheets, or whatever product they're making from those aluminum cans, they sell it to another can manufacturer or somebody who's making a good out of it. That person would not be a reporting entity. That would be the end user. So
Exactly. That's my point. All of these that I just mentioned fall within that same category. An asphalt plant is the same as making a product that as an ingot would be turned into a can. The end producer is the can manufacturing. As an asphalt manufacturing, the end user is not Coca-Cola or Budweiser, okay, or Caltrans in the case of your example. So I think you really need to think through this. And all of these, I'm arguing, should be qualified as end users.
okay, thank you. And if you could put some of your thoughts in writing as a comment, that would be helpful as well, so that we can make sure we keep track of the comments and that you have an opportunity to provide all of the reasoning and examples for the record.
Okay, and lastly, your definition for inerts includes aggregate, and I think that's inappropriate. At least the industry considers aggregate or construction aggregate as a final product that is made by specification or to a specification, and should not be considered a waste.
Okay, all right, thank you.
That's it for now.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Tony Grosso with the California Asphalt Pavement Association. Many of the points I was going to make, you've just heard, so I won't reiterate too many of them. But as I read through the regulations and the definitions, construction and demolition and inerts are sort of lumped together, but not necessarily the same. Construction demolition, for example, may, if you take down a building, have all kinds of materials in it that must be sorted, where in road construction, road pavement, road recycling, reclaimed asphalt pavement put back into the road is a singular kind of process. And so it's taken back to a facility where it's then reprocessed back into a road pavement product. It's very similar to what they took out, just a matter of reconstituting it for its own strength. So I think there's time that needs to be spent on maybe separating those discussions and definitions and regulations. And would like to, we as an association, as we hear more and more about this, we'll definitely give you a written comment on that. But the end user definition, again, as the gentleman before me explained, is something we need to focus in on, where that goes and how that's used. And secondly, then, for a lot of the companies that are integrated companies, where they're producing and placing all the same material, I think that there definitely want a consideration for end user definition. So I'll probably be back up before we get done today, but that's just to that point, and the gentleman before me made a lot of the same points that I was going to make, so no need to reiterate.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we knew that, from the beginning, the definition of end user was going to be a point where we're going to need to spend a considerable amount of time and energy, not only for us to identify what our purposes and needs are, but also to understand the myriad pieces of the industry that are different from one another and therefore have different needs and different applications. The concept of a completely vertically integrated recycling operation that removes material, say rips out an asphalt road, processes it, turns it back into new asphalt, and lays it all in the same facility is a somewhat unique situation that honestly I hadn't considered until we spoke earlier about that. And how that fits into the regulations. I think you're right, we need a good think about how facilities like that and whether there are other industry sectors that have similar considerations that we would need to take into account.
Most of the discussion I've heard here and in your previous one here in Southern California talked about every industry except ours, and so we feel there's need for clarity. So anyhow, thank you, and maybe back up.
Thank you. Did we have any more online, Alonka? Okay, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Ken Barker with Sully Miller Contracting, excuse me. I'm having a real hard time putting what we do into your language, so you're going to have to bear with me. But
Okay.
we go in under contract, say with Caltrans, and we mill up a street, take the asphalt off the street, bring it to our yard, screen it, put it back in the asphalt plant, put it in a truck, take it back to the job, and pave it. What are we?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was that sort of unusual circumstance that we were just talking with Tony a minute ago about. I think because, most of what we work with historically has been slightly less vertically integrated, where you have collection operations that sort, and then they send somebody who maybe does a wash and a grind, and they send to someone else who does a further process, and on, and it jumps a couple of times, different facilities, and those are relatively easy to put into sort of a box. It's a hauler, or it's a transporter, or it's a processor, or it's an end user. We start getting a little fuzzy when we have an entity that is everything, is the hauler, the processor, transporter, and the end user all in one. I don't have a great answer for you right now, but my guess is that for facility, because of the way the statute is written, recycling facilities, which is the only category really that you would fall into, report the material that leaves their facility, right? That goes to another facility or to an end user. If nothing ever leaves your facility, except for to be used, be applied back as an end user, perhaps there's nothing to report unless there's material that's being sent off-site for disposal. If there is some material that comes in that can't be used and therefore has to be sent to a landfill or something like that, and you otherwise meet the thresholds for being a reporting entity, you may have nothing to report for material that leaves your facility if nothing leaves, but you would still be required to report anything that goes off-site to disposal. That information would be reported to the disposal facility. You tell them where it came from, and that would essentially be the end of the reporting obligation. But, excuse me. But like I said, situations like yours are ones that we're going to have to think a little bit more about and see whether which group they fall into and what kind of information from those kinds of facilities are going to be necessary for our purposes under these regulations.
Well, just to clarify just a little bit, we do report at times at the job end. When we take material up that's part of our contract, we have to report how much material we recycle. So that goes into the system someplace. I don't know what's used, how it's used. But the material that comes to our yard, we take it, we won't accept it unless it meets the specification, and we're taking it up, so we won't bring it to our yard unless it's acceptable material. And then we process it and send it back. Now, another way to think about it, how about a job that's divorce it from asphalt? It's concrete, where you're working along a freeway right-of-way. You bring concrete and asphalt to a crusher, you crush it up, and you put it back down as base. It never leaves the process, the project. You don't have, a lot of times you don't even count loads. You just bring material in, crush it, and haul it back out. This is not being captured now, I wouldn't think.
Right. So again, I think that probably that situation where you're pulling concrete up off of the ground, you're crushing it immediately and dumping it right back on the ground again, most likely that would not meet the definition of a processor, and so you likely would not have to report for those kinds of operations. Again, these are kind of unusual situations, but probably not. But it is something that we need to look into a little bit more and at least make clear in the regulations. So I appreciate your insight on that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing anyone else, so we can move along to the next section, which is haulers. So one of the definitional areas that you'll need to sort of get familiar with is that for the purposes of these regulations, we're defining haulers as those who are picking up material from the generator. If you're picking up material from a facility, then you're a transporter. And we'll get into a little bit why that was necessary a little bit later when we talk about transporters and brokers. But for the purposes of this section, what we mean when we say the reporting requirements for haulers, we mean the reporting requirements for an entity who picks up material, solid waste, or recycling material or compostable materials from the point of generation, whether that's curbside at somebody's house or at a commercial facility or an industrial facility. Whoever it is that's generating that material, that's the hauler. Again, so haulers would only have to report directly to CalRecycle if they're picking up from, again, directly from a generator and exporting it out of the state. This is because there would be nobody else that would report that movement. There's no facility to report it, and the receiving facility is outside the state and outside of our jurisdiction. And so the only entity who could report that, that material would be the hauler. The other circumstance where a hauler would report to CalRecycle directly is if they're taking it directly to an end user for the same reason. That end user does not have to report, and therefore the only entity who could report the movement of that material is the hauler. There's not going to be a lot of situations where that's going to be the case. The ones that we've seen, we've thought about most would be directly hauling organics material for direct land application. There's likely others out there, but that's the most common one that we've come up with. For other reporting requirements not directly to CalRecycle, the haulers would have to communicate and report some information to the facilities they're taking the material to so that those facilities are able to report under their obligations. So for disposal material going to a disposal facility, the hauler would have to provide to that facility the jurisdiction of origin of the material, as well as the source sector in tons or percentage to each person that's receiving the material from them. A source sector is defined in the regulations, but this is the first time we've brought it up in this workshop, so I'll briefly go over that. Source sector is just the kind of entity that's generated the material. So whether it's single-family residential, multifamily residential, commercial, and I think there's a couple of extra ones in here too. This is in order for us to better understand where the material is being generated from, so that we have a better picture of the infrastructure available in the state. We want to be able to understand where there are potential gaps or weaknesses so that we can target our efforts for mandatory commercial recycling, mandatory organics, and without the information of knowing how this material is being generated, it's going to be very difficult for us to do that. For material that is being taken for recycling or composting, the hauler has to, if necessary, provide the material type that they're bringing to each receiving person. Again, this may be not completely necessary if the receiving entity is able to easily identify the material, but ultimately the reporting entity would be the receiving entity. So the MRF or the processor who's receiving that cardboard or those PET bottles or whatever material you're bringing would have to know what the material is. They have to report the material type that's coming out of their facility. And then because there are some additional requirements for MRFs and transfer stations, which we'll again talk about in a little bit, but the residual material that is coming out of a MRF that goes to disposal also has to have the jurisdiction of origin associated with it so that the disposal facility who's receiving it can accurately assign jurisdiction of origin for those residual materials. And so a hauler who's bringing what they feel is mostly recyclable or compostable material to a facility may have to provide some jurisdiction of origin information so that that facility has enough information to pass that along with the residuals when they send it on to a disposal facility. Now I'm going to be putting up these simplified versions of some of those complicated flowcharts that we saw at the beginning for each of these sections, so you'll have a better understanding of what the reporting relationships are. But you see here the haulers are required to tell the disposal facilities the jurisdiction of origin and source sector. They may have to tell the recycling and composters the same information depending on the circumstances. They'll also have to tell the jurisdiction of origin and source sector to transfer stations and MRFs. And then again, they would be reporting directly to CalRecycle just for exports or the amount being sent directly to an end user. So some of the areas that we need some feedback, again, like I said before, the timeline. If you recall earlier, the deadlines for facilities to report to disposal facilities was 30 days and then 45 days for the disposal facilities. The haulers are the first leg of that, and so even shorter, 15 days. So we had a tiered 15, 30, 45-day reporting time frame. That is a timeline that, again, we need some conversation with you folks about what makes sense given the operations and how you are currently gathering data and storing data and have an opportunity to report it. Like I said, at our workshop in Sacramento, we had a lot of conversation about these timelines maybe being too short. So I'd love to get some thoughts about what is a more reasonable time frame. The jurisdiction of origin and source sector, these are laid out in the regulations to allow flexibility on how this information is gathered. We realize that you're not going to be able to get 100% accuracy on all of these numbers, and that is okay. We want to make that clear that we're not requiring 7 significant figures in all of this reporting. But that you need to have some kind of reasonable methodology, which is very similar language to the existing DRS regs that allow for reasonable methodology to be used to estimate these things, whether it be by assigning specific truck types that you will assign to a particular source sector, or route information, billing records, et cetera. Any of these kinds of things could be used as reasonable methodology for making these estimates. But any thoughts on things that you've used in the past that you think would be useful for us to include as our examples, that would be very helpful for us. And then that 10% threshold that we talked about earlier, whether it's called mixed solid waste or mixed recyclables when it's being hauled, we're using the 10% partially because it's a convenient overlap with the three-part test for MRFs. But if that doesn't make sense for some reason, we'd love to hear some reasons for potentially changing that. And then, again, as I said, the haulers we're defining as picking up from generators while transporters haul from reporting entities. And again, we'll talk about it later a little bit, but it's because there are different times that the reporting is going to be necessary. And in this case, we wanted to be able to separate out the two and be able to speak about them separately. And so we're, again, using this split with haulers being picked up from generators and transporters from reporting entities. That's the end of this section, so I'd like to invite folks that have questions or comments to come on up. And while folks are getting ready, we'll see if there are any questions or comments online.
Yeah, so we have a couple comments about definitions. There's quite a bit of haulers which operate that don't have contracts or franchises because it just isn't required. And some examples would include junk removal service, C&D haulers or e-waste companies that target neighborhoods and put out flyers. So would these fall under the definition of self-hauler as it's currently written? Because it says, I just took a look at it, that anything that isn't a franchise or contracted or municipal would then be considered self-haul.
Right, so haulers include pretty much everybody that picks up material from the point of generation, including self-haulers, contracted haulers. And so I think all of those examples that were given in this question would count as haulers under the definitions. We did give some examples, but ultimately, if you're picking up material from the point of generation, whether you are the point of generation, i.e. you're self-hauling, or you're contracting with somebody like 1-800-GOT-JUNK to come pick up the material from your house or business, or you're under a franchise agreement, all of those circumstances would be considered hauler. Is there a follow-up for that, or?
Yeah, would that include landscapers who trim and remove greenery from their customers' properties and take it to a processing facility?
Yes, that would count as a hauler as well. I think, though, to remember that most haulers, under most circumstances, would not be required to report to CalRecycle. For the most part, haulers who are picking up material from a generator and taking it to a facility for some further processing only need to tell that receiving facility some information, depending on whether it's solid waste or recycling or composting material. It'll be slightly different information, but a lot of times haulers are required to provide some information at the landfill or at the composting facility or at the MRF when they drop it off. And so it would be fairly similar to existing reporting requirements. The difference would really be only if a hauler is picking up material and taking it to a facility that's out of state or directly to an end user, in which case there would be this new reporting requirement. And it's also important to remember that there are thresholds, the 10-ton threshold as well. So for small periodic haulers, if you're an individual who is hauling material yourself, if you don't reach that 10-ton threshold, then you wouldn't be considered a reporting entity either. So hopefully that answered your question, and we'll go to a question here in the room.
Davis Consulting Services. In one of your previous slides, you mentioned that recycling and composting operations at one location could have an aggregate report under certain circumstances. And I understand from your comment that was the purpose of that is to streamline and reduce paperwork. Is that pretty much the gist of it?
Well, I guess to some extent, so that provision to allow facilities to provide aggregate reporting if there are multiple operations at a single site is in statute. So that was really just pulled over from the legislative language. And it really, I think the intent was for a facility that maybe is a chip and grind that takes in wood waste, say, and chips it and then composts it on site. We don't necessarily need to have them report the movement of 80 tons of chipped wood waste, the 80 feet between the
I
chip and grind
understand.
facility, the compost facility. But we just really need to know what comes out the back end. So it's, 35 tons of finished compost comes out the end. And that is, just to clarify, restricted to facilities, to composting or recycling facilities that are operating on the same site. But if there is a recycling facility and a disposal facility on the same site, then that would be different. And we would need to know what material is passing between those facilities.
The reason I asked the question, it comes back to the hauler section of the regulations, which we're speaking of currently. If you were a self-hauler and a recycler, would there be consideration for an aggregate report under that circumstance?
So you're generating the material, so it's your own material that you're generating, and you're hauling it to your own facility that's...
No, not necessarily. You may not be generating it yourself, but you are,
So you're not a self-hauler, but you're a hauler. So you're picking it up from the point of generation.
yeah, maybe I'm not using self-hauler correctly, but what if you were a company that has their own trucks and is hauling, let's say, scrap steel to a facility that will process scrap steel, same company? Could there be circumstances to where that could have an aggregate report?
So typically speaking, the hauler in that situation, regardless whether it's owned by the processing company or not, would not need to be reporting to CalRecycle, certainly. So
Just to who they are?
just to the receiving facility, some information
Got it.
as needed for that facility to meet their reporting obligations, which,
Okay.
depending on what they do, may be very little, particularly if the residuals from that operation are very small. They may have no obligation to tell the receiving facility really anything.
Right.
Only if there's going to be a fair amount of residuals coming out would they need to provide jurisdiction of origin for those residuals.
Right. I understand the distinction now. Back to one of the last slides that you had here, feedback and questions. The first bullet point, in parentheses, you use the term land application. Could you give us a little further understanding on what that means?
Sure. So the term direct land application or land application is usually used to refer to organics that are not composted, but are applied directly to the land as an uncomposted organic material.
Okay, all right. The next bullet point, you asked for input on source sectors. The folks that are within the construction materials industry and recycle construction materials that come from a job site, would it be unreasonable, and you mentioned that you were hoping to get input to make this more simple. This would be more simple for us if we could create a source sector that source would be construction and demolition.
We did sort of consider that. I think the problem that we came up with is that construction and demolition doesn't really describe the source that it came from, but the operations that generated it. And so it wouldn't help us understand whether it came from residential or commercial or municipal or industrial kind of source. It would just tell us that the material type, it's more of a material type than a source sector, construction and demolition, because you can get the same materials derived from a commercial building as you can from a residential building. So we were hoping to get with the source sector data is really where is it coming from? Is it being generated from residential, multifamily residential, or commercial? C&D has been sort of a special category for quite a while.
Thank you.
And I mean, you know, we've managed it and addressed it over the years in a number of different ways. And you know, we're certainly open to having some more conversations about how to address C&D material. At the moment, I wouldn't think that we would leave it as a source sector, a separate source sector, because it really doesn't fall into the same kind of category. But rather, like I said, it's more a material type rather than a source sector.
Well, you can imagine from my question and comment that, and you were trying to make this more simple. That's what I agree with that. And if we had to document where every truck, which came from a construction project or a demolition project, had to go the next step and say, oh, that was tearing down an apartment building, or this was tearing down a McDonald's, or this was tearing down a hospital, you know, that is just getting out of control.
Okay, appreciate your feedback on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity. I'm Mike Wiedeker with the City of Glendale, and my question is about the provision at landfills for haulers to report more than one jurisdiction. Our experience with our own Shoal Canyon landfill, which serves 7 community waste shed, is that a truck will show up and simply report one entity, when in fact the truck has serviced 3 or perhaps even 4 communities as they were handling their route. And to us, it may make sense to allow or to require haulers to report if more than one jurisdiction was served as the origin of the material.
Absolutely. The intention is for the data to be provided, that is being provided by the haulers to the disposal facility, to be accurate and reflective of reality. So if they went to just one jurisdiction, then they should report just one jurisdiction. But if they went to 5 or 7, they should report those 5 or 7. And we would be engaging with our enforcement office to conduct audits or investigations or enforcement action if there are circumstances where entities, haulers, disposal facilities, MRFs, transfer stations, whomever, are providing information that is incorrect, to make sure that we get those facilities or entities into compliance and that they're providing accurate data.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else online?
Yeah, so how would we handle if the source sector is not known or is a combination of unknown proportions?
So again, that would sort of fall into the category of reasonable methodologies, whether it's, so some of the examples that we gave in the regulations, but other things that we could do are, assigning particular truck types to the source sector. If you know that for the most part, the side loaders are picking up from residential and the front loaders are picking up from some combination of multifamily and commercial, you can assign your best estimate of that breakdown. You could use billing information. If you know the billing information, you can tell the difference between a residential versus a commercial, and that could be a source of information to identify the source sector. And the same with jurisdiction of origin, honestly. There honestly could be a lot of other potential methods that would be reasonable, and those would be things that we would, love to hear about, because if there are good, reasonable methodologies out there that people are using, we'd like to include them in our list of examples so that others have the benefit of that. And also, great opportunity for us to speak with those who are engaged in it, so that we can, if necessary, make some adjustments to the regulations to make it work for the purposes of either jurisdictions or facilities that are making estimates or have ideas about how to make those estimates. So again, we're trying to make this relatively easy to comply with while providing a decent amount of information. We know it's not going to be perfect, and we don't expect it to be perfect, but we want good estimates based on, again, reasonable methodologies. And in the room here, yes.
Hi, my name's Karen Coca. I'm with the City of Los Angeles. We actually have quite a bit of experience, 13-plus years now, with certification of facilities and doing basically mass balance, which is what you're talking about, estimates. One of the comments that I have, though, is that I'm not sure what you're trying to get at by the sector, because dividing it that way, but then allowing them to aggregate at the facility side is just going to give you bad numbers. I'll be very specific about what it is. We, for many years, we've had along with our certification program, we've had a rebate program where our permitted haulers pay us fees, and they can get rebates if they recycle material. But the proof is that they have to deliver the material to a certified facility. We go into those facilities and we certify them. Now, there's several facilities that not only take multiple streams, C&D, food waste, and recycling. And what we do is we do a mass balance and assign a recycling rate for each process. And the reason being is that the rebates are different depending on what you recycle. Plus, if you have material like C&D, you can get 85% recycling out of it, whereas if it's mixed solid waste, you get about 20 to 25. So there's always been a benefit to separate those streams by the major, materials that they collect. So I'm not sure what you think you're going to get out of it. Maybe we can talk offline. My folks have been doing this for a long time. One of the things that we found is that this methodology works very well on sort of a gross scale, but now that we're going through our franchise efforts, we actually need more information than that, because we have to determine how much a facility is going to recycle out of the material that comes from the City of Los Angeles. So if you go to let's say what we call a blue bin MRF, so the commingled recyclables that we pick up from commercial, multifamily, and single family all go to one facility. We want to identify how much of that material was actually recycled out of that stream, not the aggregate of the other 30, jurisdictions or haulers that have been taking material in there. So I'd like to work with you guys to figure out how to make the reporting at least somewhat concurrent, because we're going to be requiring a lot of reporting out of the facilities, and it doesn't sound like you're going to that level of detail. The other one about the sectors, I just want to make a comment, and that is that City of Los Angeles, we collect from single family and some multifamily. Some were grandfathered in. Our franchise is going to be for commercial, the rest of the multifamily, and industrial. Oh, the city also picks up institutional city facilities, and all this stuff gets mixed together. So even if we identify it, this percentage is multifamily versus commercial, I don't think you're going to get really accurate information about how much recyclable material is in multifamily versus commercial, how much, so that's why I'm trying to figure out what you're trying to get at.
Sure, and I'll try to address some of those issues one at a time. So one, the idea of getting sort of a recycling rate from a facility really is not the purpose of what we're doing here. In fact,
Okay.
we wouldn't really have the ability to get that information anyway. So a recycling facility reports to us only what leaves the facility. So we wouldn't get what's coming in order to be able to calculate that sort of rate. We get all of the recycling material that leaves plus the total disposal, which essentially adds up to everything unless there's stockpiling or holdover. which would be the error rate. So you could kind of get a little bit close. But again, that's really not the purpose of the reporting, to find out the recycling rate either for a jurisdiction or for a facility, but rather to understand where material is flowing through the system, how it's being processed, and how it's moving, whether it's going to disposal, how it gets there, where it came from, the jurisdiction of origin, or how recyclable or compostable material is flowing, how it's being processed, and where it's sort of where it's ending, so that we understand the flow and the magnitude of those flows through the system, but not necessarily, again, for identifying rates, which I know are very important for others, including the jurisdictions, but that's not really the purpose of these reporting requirements. They will, I'm sure, help inform some of that, but it won't be the main driving force or reason for the reporting. Okay. And then for the source sectors, really what we're getting at is sort of the beginning. We've never really looked into getting this information except through our waste characterization studies and some of the source surveys that we've done, but those are only every few years, and they're sort of a limited piece of the pie. And so any additional information that we're going to be getting moving forward, while we realize is imperfect and not a complete picture and not 100% accurate, it's going to be leagues better than what we are getting now, which is a tiny snapshot every 2, 4, 6 years whenever we do one of these studies. And so, yes, we realize that it will be sort of lacking in clarity, but it will be a lot better, and it will help give us sort of directional trends or changes and sort of big picture, broad strokes where this material is coming from.
So just a follow-up question then. So you're planning on following the material through the entire daisy chain then? Because we have a lot of material that goes to what we call a primary processor, and then the material goes to a secondary processor, and sometimes the material goes to a third processor before it actually goes to the end user. These are,
Right.
It's a real example. Like if a
Of course.
MRF has to process, say, 50 tons an hour, they know that they can't pull all of the CRV off. So they will send their residual to a secondary processor who takes more time and pulls that off, but then they only pull 6 items, and then they take the rest and send it somewhere else. It happens all the time.
Of course.
Is that something that you guys are going to be trying to track?
Yep. So while we're not looking to track like an individual, unit, a bottle or a can
Right.
or a whatever, that as it moves and where it goes, but all of those different transfers, as you explained, those would all be captured as reporting entities. So that MRF that's sending out bales of, say, mixed plastics or PET bottles would report that, and they would report, and I sent this, depending on the makeup of it, either mixed solid waste or mixed recyclables to this other MRF, and then that MRF would say, I sent off, X number of tons of, plastics or paper,
Okay.
and X number of tons to disposal. And again, following those bales, if someone breaks the mixed plastics and they send off bales of PET plus bales of HDPE and bales of, 3 through 7s, that would be tracked. And then the
Okay.
receiving facilities, again, if they're further processing them, washing them, flaking them, pelletizing, whatever, those facilities would also be reporting.
And the boundary is state of California?
Yeah, we can't require facilities outside of the state to
Right.
report to us.
Okay.
So the last leg that we could get would be a facility telling us who they sent it to outside and where they are. So if they're sending it to somebody in Nevada or Idaho or China or wherever, they would tell us who it is that they're sending it to, but that's where our authority would end.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, we've got another question or comment.
Hi, thank you. Kelly Astor on behalf of the waste hauling industry, or most of it anyway. The conversation you just now had is extremely important to my clients, and I'd like to commend you for the answer that I just heard. As Christine and others will recall from the negotiations surrounding AB 901, we had a concern very early on about anything approaching a MRF certification. or the idea that the state was going to rank for some purpose or another the performance of these facilities. So many of these facilities are privately financed. Many of them have not yet reached your maximum useful life. And the last thing we need is to have somebody start ranking performance based on what they foresee as a better system, because there's always new development occurring. Those pressures we prefer to see come from the local agency that we serve through the franchise agreements or through the open system. So we're very anxious that you do, at all costs, avoid collecting that kind of data and then developing some kind of a matrix for how a MRF is expected to perform. It's a variation of the same debate between whether a mixed waste facility is or isn't superior to a facility that just receives certain categories of material. So I'm delighted to hear that that's not your intention at this point. I also would simply remind all of us that in AB 901, we spoke of 75% as a statewide policy goal. I suppose that some of this source sector information that you seek is necessary to at least allow you to track overall performance, but we're after a generalized statewide goal, not specific to jurisdictions or facilities, and not even specific to material types, as I understand the way that policy objective is written. That's a far different thing, of course, in AB 939 and how we measure progress there, but this is a separate set of criteria. So my clients are more than willing to get you what you need, but in all candor, they don't want to get you any more than you need. And not because of the difficulty sometimes in getting that, but there's always the concern we harbor for misuse of that material, whether it is to police our facilities in a way we don't want to see ourselves regulated, or in the case of source sector data, allowing our competitors to come in and essentially reverse engineer the franchise. So we want to be helpful. We were supporters of AB 901. On this limited question of certification and MRF performance, I'm delighted to hear what I heard from you earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, was there anything else online? Okay, why don't we read another one?
One question was, why is source sector not including institutional or industrial municipal categories?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that was another balancing act that we went through as we were looking at this information. We wanted to identify the sectors that would give us the most useful information without creating any additional hardship that wasn't necessary. So where we drew the line was we looped sort of everything into commercial that would include industrial and sort of municipal kind of sources into one big category of commercial. That's certainly something that we're open to further discussion about. We didn't see that it was going to bring us enough additional useful information to justify the additional burden that it would put on the industry. But again, like I said, we're happy to entertain additional possibilities, and if you have any thoughts about why those particular sectors might be useful, please send them in either via email or if you have written comments that you'd like to send in, and we'll certainly consider them.
Also, when will the jurisdictions receive data from CalRecycle for their fees and billing on tonnages?
So I think maybe there's two parts to that. So jurisdictions can still require haulers or facilities to submit information to them via authority from their franchise agreements, any other contracts they have, or local ordinances that give them authority to require reporting for their billing to their the residents, et cetera. So all of that will be left untouched and not really, CalRecycle really doesn't have anything to do with that side of things. The data, though, that's being provided to CalRecycle via the DDRS, we don't have a clear timeline on how long it will take for us to compile those data and make sure that the information that's being aggregated and made available to the jurisdictions and to the general public will be ready, partially because we're still trying to figure out exactly what information we're getting. These stakeholder workshops are to help us understand what kinds of data we'll be getting. And until the regs are finalized, we won't know 100% all of the data that we're getting. So we don't know exactly what it will take for us to get it ready for public consumption. So I can't answer that right now. So apologize for that, but as we get closer, we should be able to have a better idea of how long it will take to make the data ready for public.
And then John Sitz had an additional comment about the split between commercial and residential as our source sectors. And some of those drivers are so that we can understand how the mandatory commercial recycling and the mandatory organics commercial recycling are working. And so we can get information about the commercial sector as a whole for those goals. I have another question about SB 20 and SB 50. For haulers, does this include companies or individuals that pick up TVs and monitors and electronics from residential and businesses? The display units that we receive as a recycler from the hauler are already reported to CalRecycle by us as part of the monthly claim. So do we as a recycler need to report these materials for AB 901 even though we already do so in the SB 2050 claim?
Yeah, so this is related to e-waste, which is one of the targeted categories. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, that list was something that we thought about and tried to identify categories where we may still have useful information out there that we're not gathering. The world of electronics waste includes covered electronics, which are the displays that I think this question was specifically referring to, but also includes the broader category that we're considering here, which would be essentially the U-waste electronic devices definition, which is pretty much what we copied into the definition. So it would include things that are electronic devices that are not covered electronics, and they're not displays. That we typically refer to as CEW or covered electronic waste. I think that for those materials where there is some reporting, but perhaps not enough reporting, or the reporting could be improved, that this was a category that we thought there was additional area where we could get better data about where the material is going. And I think I would need a little bit more about the specific situations, but if there is an entity that's reporting under 901 as a processor, then the hauler of that material would not be required to report to CalRecycle. That's sort of general, not just for electronics, but for all materials. If it's coming from a generator, so a hauler is moving it to a processing facility of some sort, that hauler would not be required to report to CalRecycle. So I hope that answered your question, and if not, perhaps you could provide some more specific details in an email later, or if you have written comments that you want to provide at the end of the workshop. Are there any?
We have a few more.
Okay, we've got some more online. Looks like this is a hot topic.
As a landfill operator, we would have a major concern in collecting information on source sector from all haulers. We collect origin from self-haulers at the landfill. Origin from commercial haulers is collected via an electronic reporting system. The source sector definition refers to franchise commercial haulers broken down by residential, multifamily, and commercial, and then self-haulers. Not all commercial haulers are franchised haulers, but just account holders, i.e. entities that haul from construction projects, landscapers, or roofers, etc. Collecting source sector adds another layer that will be virtually impossible to collect from all haulers.
Right, I think there was maybe two points. One that I wanted to clarify, and perhaps it was just my understanding, but as far as franchise commercial versus self-haul commercial, we're talking about the source of it. So if it's being hauled via a franchise agreement from a commercial entity, then that would fall into the franchise commercial. If it's being self-hauled, i.e. an actual company's trucks hauling it from their commercial facility, that's self-haul. If a commercial entity hires a third party to haul it for them on their behalf, that would still fall under the self-hauled commercial category.
I think that would fall under franchise. The definition of franchise includes contracted, so if you pay someone else to haul it for you, then that would be under
Okay,
franchise.
great. So, so that, just to clarify the difference between those, and then we do realize that there are a lot of concerns about gathering the information on source sector from the haulers, and I think that some of that can be dealt with perhaps more easily than some fear, though I certainly understand that this is a new piece of data to be gathered and that there's going to be some growing pains with that and that it won't be a simple matter. But the information can be gathered from direct survey with the haulers as they come to the gate, or from billing records that the haulers submit after the fact on an aggregated basis for the quarter, or based on the type of truck that's coming in, if there are reasonable estimates to use based on those truck types, or if there are other methods of data collection that you can use that we can sort of assume is a reasonable methodology to make an estimate for where this material is coming from. It does not have to be a direct question to every hauler for every load that comes into the facility. That could work for some facilities, but it might not for everybody. And in those cases, we want to have the flexibility for facilities to use whatever mechanism works well for them, and as long as it's still a reasonable estimate.
There's more.
There's another one? Okay. Maybe we'll just take this one last one, and then we'll loop back later if there are additional at the end.
Will receiving facilities be asking haulers, including self-haulers and junk removal, for the needed information? These non-franchise haulers are not accustomed to reporting.
Yeah, so that will be a new reporting requirement for some facilities or for some entities. They may be in a position where they're being asked information at the gate that they haven't been asked for before, or they may be asked after the fact to provide information. It depends on what material is being hauled and the relationship that the receiving facility has with those haulers. So in some circumstances, with a large hauling operation that brings a lot of material, they may have an agreement to provide quarterly summaries. And other, maybe smaller haulers, they provide the information at the gate. And then maybe even smaller still haulers or self-haulers, they may just do an estimate at the gate, and they don't even ask the question to the hauler at all. They just, okay, you're in a pickup truck, that's residential, and you just mark it down, and that tonnage is assigned to residential, single-family residential, or bigger trucks are assigned to other groups based on the configuration of those trucks. So I think that there could be a number of mechanisms used to make these estimates, and we can help identify some of the options, but the folks that are in the industry and doing this are either facility operators or haulers. If you guys have ideas on what works, what could be a good opportunity, a good estimating methodology, like I said before, we'd really love to hear what those are. As long as it's reasonable, I think we would be amenable to using those methodologies. Okay, I think we're going to move on just to keep things going. It is 2:30. So I'll just move on to the next section, and then we'll try to get back to some other questions on these sections later at the end when we have a general question and answer. Oops. So transfer stations and MRFs. These are sort of a unique group of facilities that are not disposal facilities, and they do fall into the general category of recycling or composting facilities because they handle recycling or composting material, but there are some special considerations because of the way that their operations work. So what do these facilities have to report? For any residuals that come out of their operations or material that is just simply moving through for disposal, particularly in the case of transfer stations. This information has to come with it, besides the tons or percentage, the jurisdiction of origin and source sector. So this is material that's going to a disposal facility. That disposal facility needs to be able to report the jurisdiction of origin and the source sector from these facilities. For recyclable or compostable material, again, they report like a processor. They report the tons per material type to each receiving person, and it's reported at the level that it was sold or transferred at, whether it's mixed recyclables or mixed paper or aluminum or PET, whatever it is that they're sending it out, whatever level of detail that they're sending it out as, that is what needs to be reported to CalRecycle. These facilities would report directly to CalRecycle. And again, this timeline, as we've mentioned a number of times already, is subject to some discussion. But this information is information that we need directly for the recyclable and compostable materials. The residuals and disposal is actually information that the receiving disposal facility needs in order to finalize their report to CalRecycle. But because these facilities process and send large quantities of material to disposal facilities, the information will be provided directly to CalRecycle, and then CalRecycle's electronic system will allocate it directly to the disposal facility that is being sent to. So as an example, I operate a landfill and I get material from 3 transfer stations. Rather than having to wait for those transfer stations to give me information, they report directly to CalRecycle, and then when I go in as a landfill operator and log into the electronic reporting system, there will be all of the tons and the jurisdiction of origin and source sector for all of the material that came from those 3 transfer stations that sent material to my landfill. And now my responsibility is to do 2 things. 1, review that information to make sure it's accurate. And if it is, you're done. If it isn't, then you submit a request for the change, that the information is wrong. And the second is to report all of the other material that was brought to your facility from haulers or self-haulers that are not transfer stations and MRFs. So it takes a big chunk of the reporting and has it done and allocated automatically in the system. So you have one portion of the data that you just review and approve, and the other portion of the data that you submit. So hopefully this will cut down on the amount of time needed to complete the reporting and reduce the overall amount of effort that it will take to complete the report. As I said, another little mini flow chart. So as you can see here, we have MRFs and transfer stations on the left. They send material back and forth between themselves. And with that, the disposal information, they'll have to send along the jurisdiction of origin and source sector. And then MRFs and transfer stations will report tons and jurisdiction of origin, source sector, et cetera, to CalRecycle, and then CalRecycle will make that information available to the disposal facilities via the DDRS online reporting system for approval, for review and approval, to make sure that it's accurate. So some of the areas that we like to either add some clarity or get some feedback on. The receiving entity for the material coming out of a MRF or a transfer station can be anybody. It could be a recycler, a composter, an end user, a broker, transporter, exporter, directly applied to the land, or a disposal facility. So it really does not matter who you're sending it to as a MRF or transfer station. That entity needs to be reported to CalRecycle. And again, the material type is to be reported at the level it was sold or transferred. Either the commodity materials that we're used to, or organics, or it could be mixtures that go out if you're sending out mixed papers and plastics, or metals and plastics, or mixed recyclables, or mixed compostables, or mixed waste, et cetera. Whatever it is that's leaving your facility, that's what we want to have reported. So for MRFs and transfer stations, that's the end. If there are any questions or comments on this section, either in the room or online, we can take a break and answer those now. Nothing online? We have one coming up in the room.
Yeah, let's take that.
Good afternoon. Trevor Wood with Chandler Sand and Gravel. So we have our own transfer station that we will be taking the material to our own end use. So our transfer station will now report to you. Am I correct on that?
I think so. If you can.
It's all intercompany.
So but where it matters more about where the material's coming from and going to.
Okay.
So if it's coming from someplace off-site to your facility and then coming out of your facility to someplace else, even if you own all of them, that would probably all still be reportable. If it's being generated and sort of managed all on site, perhaps not. So I'd need a little bit more
So
clarity.
transfer station would be just like any other transfer yard. We'd be receiving material there from the public. And then from that particular yard, we would be taking it to our end use site in a different location, which also receives material from the public.
So probably what you would need to report is the transfer of material that leaves your transfer site to the end use.
Okay, so that would no longer be being reported to you directly
That
from the
you know,
transfer yard portion of
no,
it?
so the transfer station, the transfer yard would report directly to CalRecycle.
Okay,
And it would report, if it's going for sort of more of a recycling use rather than disposal, is what it's sounding like to
a
me.
little bit of both,
A little bit of both.
land reclamation,
Okay, so yeah, so
that's
if
a whole
it's,
nother topic.
so as it goes out, your transfer station as the reporting entity is not a disposal facility. So we're not looking at the requirements for a disposal facility, but we are looking at the requirements for a recycling operation.
Okay,
So what you would be required to report are tons by material type sent out to another processor or an end user or whoever you're sending it to, and total tons that's sent to a disposal facility.
okay.
And if you
So-
send material to a disposal facility, then you need to assign the jurisdiction and source sector for that portion of the stream.
Okay, and if it's separated, so it's both, some is being recycled, some is being strictly disposed of?
Yeah, so you report both. Tons by material type for anything that's being recycled, sent off for recycling, and tons in jurisdiction of origin for anything that's going to disposal. And so yeah, you would report both of those.
Okay, so again, even though it's intercompany from the transfer yard directly to the end-use disposal site, that transfer yard now has to report to CalRecycle, and the end-use site doesn't really change because we already report.
So the end use site would not need to report under these regs. If there are other reporting requirements elsewhere, that wouldn't change, but under these regs for 901 reporting, the end use wouldn't have to report.
Okay,
But as a transfer station, sending materials out for further processing or an end use would have to report that transfer.
okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Gloria with County Ventura. I've been wearing this DRS hat for so long, it's kind of hard to switch, so just kind of want clarity. Through the DRS system, when material goes to our CME landfill, we always get a total throughput. So in turn, when I do the DRS, I get everything that goes to CME, it comes to me, and those are even materials that come from a transfer station, you know, that they have outbound. It's all by jurisdiction and what have you. So what I'm hearing now is when the landfill reports to CalRecycle through this new system, they're only going to report what comes into them outside of the transfer stations?
Outside of the transfer stations and MRFs. So,
Correct.
yeah, the data
Okay.
will still be there as far
Right.
as what went to that landfill from transfer stations and MRFs. It's just that the transfer stations and MRFs will be reporting that directly to CalRecycle. So it
Okay.
will be sort of pre-populated in the landfill's system.
Okay.
So they will go in and log in and they'll see all of those, all of the material by jurisdiction of origin that came from transfer stations and MRFs, and it'll be sitting there for them to review. And then their responsibility would be then, after they've reviewed that, to input all of the material that came to them from other sources.
Okay.
So you'll
okay.
still get the total picture. It'll
Okay.
just be, some of it will be input directly by the landfill, and some of it will be input by the MRFs or transfer stations.
So as a jurisdiction, though, will we be able to access the system to see what actually is going to CalRecycle from the landfills and the transfer stations? At what level?
Yeah, so we don't have the details of that worked out just yet. We want to be able to make the information available to jurisdictions in a usable manner, but there could potentially be some confidential business information or proprietary information that we wouldn't necessarily be able to release. And I don't know enough about the information that we'll be getting or that will be needed by the jurisdictions to be able to answer that fully. But our intention is to make as much information available that we can while still respecting the confidential information that some of the facilities might be providing.
Okay, because I wear a couple hats. I wear the hat, we're contracted with all of our haulers in Ventura County, so I get very detailed information from our contracted haulers, so I feel very comfortable about that. What I'm missing now is what's going to be provided to whether it be the transfer station or the landfill that I'll be able to do the QA on, getting back to making sure that we're always able to meet our requirements of our diversion mandates. So, you know, that's where I'm coming from, is who's going to be doing the QA of the information as it goes to the transfer stations or the MRFs or the landfill.
Right, and I don't know if Christine wants to jump in on this one.
Yeah, so just to clarify, as it relates to disposal, it's going to be very similar in the sense of what's currently being done, as in the law is clear that jurisdictions may request the disposal related. Where some of the, I think what Robert was alluding to in some of the limitations in sharing data, that's more specific to the recycling and compost data that we received. So again, it's all one system, but the way the law is written, there are more requirements in terms of aggregation and what the department may or may not share in terms of recycling. So just wanted to clarify.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes.
Tom Davis. Back in 2002, when CalRecycle was known as the California Integrated Waste Management Board, we went through a similar process. I was involved in the workshopping of those regulations, in particular Article 5.95 of Title 14, which basically set out formally recognizing that an inert debris fill operation is special. And special recognition that it only was required to be on the enforcement agency notification tier level of regulations, which is the lower level of the three that were put together at that point in time. And the reason IDEFOs were given special attention is because the operator of an IDEFO was given a credit or incentives, if you will, to create a piece of property after they were done with their operation. And I'm just going to read part of a sentence from the regulation. In order to provide land that is appropriate for an end use consistent with approved local general and specific plans, as an example, roads, building sites, and other improvements. So having said that, recognizing that IDEFOs have a special place in waste management kingdom, and by the way, That tier regulation set forth in Article 5.95 does not require IDEFOs to have a solid waste facilities permit, okay? So having said that, we look at the definitions in the draft regulations here and go down to permitted landfill that refers to a definition found in Title 14, 18720, so on and so forth. A permitted landfill means a solid waste landfill for which there exists a current solid waste facilities permit. So putting two and two together, an IDEFO, because it doesn't need a solid waste facilities permit, by definition is not a permitted landfill. So the material that comes into an IDEFO is a subset of solid waste. It is basically source separated concrete and asphalt, some other ingredients, all inert, and is used as construction fill, which by definition is a beneficial reuse. And at the end of the day, something is typically going to be built on top of that IDEFO, former IDEFO, if you will. Not like a landfill, which typically you would not build on. So having said that, I would like to suggest to you that IDEFOs be considered an end user. And why I believe it should be an end user is this. It is taking a material that has been essentially source separated and or recycled, however that fits into the definition, and is being used, a beneficial reuse as construction fill in area excavation, typically a former gravel pit, that ultimately will produce a site for a second productive use. The material that is brought in, process set forth, the end user is the site, okay? And I would like to suggest that you consider that the definition of IDEFOs be recognized in the definition section of these draft regulations and qualified as an end user.
Thank you. I'm not thoroughly familiar with these IDEFO facilities, but from what your description of them is, I think I would agree with you that they probably do fit into the end user category. They seem to fit that definition fairly well, and we'll look into it a little bit more, but to add in a little bit more clarity, to add more examples in different sectors that meet the requirements of the end user for ease of understandability of the regulations, I think would be helpful in general. So yeah, I mean, basically if an entity or an operation is using this finished product, they are the end user. So they would not be a reporting entity. It would just be if there are facilities that are handling and processing or shipping material to that end user, they would be reporting.
Right.
But the end user themselves, that IDEFO or the construction site, would be the end user and therefore not have to report.
If you were to, thank you, I see that you are seeing the light, if you will. If you dig in further into the definition of IDEFO, basically the difference between an IDEFO and a regular old construction site that needs construction fill is the size of the beast. If you have a construction site that needs construction fill and can get all that done in a year or two, you're an IDEFO, or you're not an IDEFO. If you're a construction site that is receiving material to be used as construction fill and your project is going to last longer then a year or two, you're IDEFO. That's just the way the regulations are written. So the point is, IDEFOs are construction sites, and the material that are going into them is construction fill. And so I would suggest that take further consideration of that point.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have anything come in online? Let's take a question or two from online.
Will transfer station reports include 100% of materials shipped or only those streams that are above 10 tons per quarter?
So it would be all of it. The 10-ton threshold would be for the entire facility. So if the entire facility does not ever handle more than 10 tons for the entire quarter, then they don't have to report anything. If they handle 11 or more tons for the quarter, they have to report everything. So I think that answered the question. Do we have any others coming in from email?
Waste loads, okay, so the title is, can't rely on transfer stations to properly distinguish the landfill, what the landfill actually did with the waste material after, it's not showing me the full title, but I'm sorry. Waste loads are often different weights when comparing outgoing load based on transfer station scales and incoming load based on landfill scales. And additionally, transfer stations don't know how much will ultimately be disposed versus used beneficially on site at the landfill. So why aren't landfills going to be required to report, since they are the only entity that can confirm what was actually disposed versus not disposed?
Great, so landfills absolutely will have to report. That's the next section that we'll be talking about. There is going to be some discrepancy from some facilities where the outgoing weights don't necessarily match the weights being reported by the receiving facility. That is understandable, and there'll be some sort of built-in accommodation for that. But also realize that the reporting is not meant to create 100% mass balance, but to understand where things are going. So if there's a situation where a transfer station reports 1,000 tons of material sent to a landfill, and landfill's records show that it's really 973 tons, that would be the opportunity where the landfill is reviewing the data submitted by that transfer station and to say, hey, this isn't right, it should be 973, not 1,000. There'll be a mechanism to allow for that correction. And then hopefully in the future, some mechanism can be worked out either at the transfer station or the landfill so that corrections and adjustments will become less and less frequent as the system matures. Anything else?
For this section, I think that's it.
Great. Seeing nothing else in the room, we will move on to the next section, which, as I just alluded to, is disposal facilities. You'll see a definition of disposal facilities in the definition section, but we're essentially looking at landfills, transformation facilities, and engineered municipal solid waste facilities. The kinds of information that will need to be reported for material that is disposed on site: we need total tons, jurisdiction of origin and source sector, as well as tons of C&D material and the jurisdiction of origin and source sector. For the material that's being used on site for beneficial reuse, tons of material type to each of the beneficial reuse types. Again, those are listed in the definition section. And you can see some listed here: ADC, AIC, final cover, liner level, et cetera, et cetera. And then some landfills may be sending material offsite for recycling or composting, depending on what they get and how their operations work. And so if they are sending material offsite for recycling or composting, then we will need them to report like a recycling or composting facility. So they'll need to report tons per material type sent to each receiver. And again, that material should be reported at the level that it was sold or transferred. So very similar. The facility, anybody who's really handling or processing recyclables or compostables report the same, whether they're a MRF or a disposal facility or a processor. It's all very consistent across these different facility types. And again, the little mini flow chart here, we have haulers bringing material into disposal facilities. They need to pass on information about where that material came from. Transfer stations and MRFs will be bringing material to disposal facilities, but reporting directly to CalRecycle. You see that sort of skinny arrow going directly to CalRecycle there. The big fat arrow represents material flow. So the transfer stations and MRFs submit to CalRecycle. The dotted line coming from the disposal facilities and meeting up with that little skinny line from the transfer stations and MRFs is to represent your verification of those, of that information being submitted by the transfer stations and MRFs. And then the disposal facilities are required to submit all of the additional information that comes from other haulers that are not transfer stations or MRFs. So this is less an area of feedback that we're looking for, but I wanted to provide a point of clarification that disposal facilities, as well as other entities, must continue to provide information to government entities for other purposes based on that jurisdiction's authority. So if there are city ordinances or provisions in a contract or in a franchise agreement or any other source of authority that a city or a county or other jurisdiction has to require information from a hauler or a disposal facility or a MRF, et cetera, none of what we're doing here with the DDRS for 901 reporting preempts any of that. So all of that would remain in force, and that information would still have to be reported to the jurisdiction. That's the end of the disposal discussion. So I'll invite folks to come up and ask some questions or provide comments. Seeing nobody running down the aisles at the moment, do we have anything online? So we'll take a question or two online.
What purpose will the current quarterly survey week serve when AB 901 allocations are required per vehicle, which can occur many times per day?
Can you repeat that? I'm not sure that I'm familiar with the quarterly
I think
survey.
the survey week was for landfills that didn't have scales, and they could assert, I think that's something about the lack of scales, that they could do a survey instead.
So,
For
I mean,
the conversion factors, for the volume
I
conversions.
suppose we could make a guess about what the question is asking, but I'd rather maybe give a moment and see if this person can provide a little bit more clarity about what they're asking about, because I'm not that familiar with the existing DRS system to know what they're referring to, and I don't know if anyone else in the room, maybe that makes more sense, or if John's on and he has some more information. But at the
He's
very
typing.
least, we can check back with the person who's asked this question and check in with John and the rest of our DRS team and get back to the group about a response. But John may be typing a response as we speak. While we wait for that, do we have any other questions online?
Not on landfills.
Not online. Anybody in the room have a question or comment about this section for the disposal facilities?
Hi, Kelly Astor again. I don't know that this is responsive to the specific section you just left, but something just occurred to me that I wanted to share with you. When AB 901 was being written, we were very anxious to preserve the integrity and the protection of certain proprietary information that the haulers would generate. And the bill acknowledges that there's a Public Records Act exemption for that material. Conversely, things that are reported to you in the first instance, not the stuff that you want to come back and audit us for, those are public records. But as I'm listening to the presentation, we're struck by the fact that it's a very competitive world out there, and while the haulers may not have as big a concern about protecting the identity of where they dispose of their material, in terms of where they're recycling it, with whom, the markets in Southern California in particular are so limited that there's often an acute need on the hauler's part to keep as private as possible how he or she may be marketing their material, because that recipient of that material may have a limited capacity. And so if they're the ones with the relationship, they may not want other of their competitors to know how they're marketing material that's got limited market. So I'd like to at least begin a dialogue today with council and others on how we might offer a veneer of protection over that data, even if it's going into a report that's otherwise public. I know there's the trade secret statute that is cited in the regulations and which predates AB 901. As I've discussed with Mr. Block in the past, not a perfect statute, but maybe that's a starting point for us. But I just wanted to call out here in today's meeting, and maybe we'll address with you privately, this idea that there are portions of what we're going to be obligated to report to you as facility operators, which will still contain very highly sensitive data. I know you need some of that data to properly track where the material's going and progress toward 75%, but we have to account for the fact that the markets here are so competitive and there's a limited amount of markets that we need to, I think, work together on crafting something beyond what the regs now say to offer us some protection against disclosure of that information. Thank you.
Sure, and I'll say a few words, and perhaps others will want to weigh in as well. But this may be sort of the new terminology, not really taking hold yet. But so haulers would be those just picking up from generators directly to the first processor. Those entities would not really be reporting at all any information about what they're bringing or where it came from to CalRecycle. But there would be information under the current writing of the regs of a facility, a MRF, or a processor sending material out to another facility or processor, what that material is and to whom it's being sent. And perhaps that was the area where you're referring to, is potentially seeing that customer list of who I'm sending my material and how it's being characterized, what type of material is being sent and marketed.
Yeah, not a customer, it's a vendor list. The people that supply us with the markets they'll take our material and apply it to whatever use they can. We're selling it to them,
right,
and or paying them to process it further. But it's very, very competitive. I'm thinking particularly in terms of organics, but I suppose it applies to some degree to any other form of commodity out there.
Sure.
We don't have the robust markets we need to even support the AB 939 infrastructure, let alone 75%. So.
Yeah, and I think, you're probably seeing the same things we were, is that a lot of this information is incredibly helpful for us, but is not information that necessarily at that level of detail needs to be put out into the world as a public document. The public-facing information, would need to be more broad and general about the kinds of materials that are moving generally, but don't need to know the exact movement of a particular bale to a particular facility and the makeup of that
right.
bale of
It's
material.
the same logic that led the state ultimately to agree to our request for the right to aggregate.
Sure. Yeah, and we are in the same understanding about that need to protect that information while still having a need for us to get it. And so I agree. We do need to do a little bit of work on how to craft some language to make sure that it's clear to everybody that is in fact the intention, that kind of private business information is not meant to be released out to the public.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Anything else online?
John, just want to emphasize that those customer lists and the individual receivers of material would not be made public. That is confidential data that would only be released as an aggregate number.
Great, thank you. Okay, seeing no more questions, we'll move on. I'm actually going to pass the presentation on to my colleague Ilanka for the next two sections. So Polina, if you'd pass the clicker.
Okay, so now we're going to be talking about recycling and composting operations. So these are, for the recyclers, this is going to include all of the processors of our commodity recyclables, the C and D that we do not consider to be end users, organics recycling like mulching, and the targeted materials recyclers that handle electronics, mattresses, textiles, and the remainder of the list that we provided for targeted materials. This is basically after it leaves the MRF, wherever it would end up. For composting, that would include any facility that does composting or digesting that takes organics, including wastewater treatment plants or other operations that have on-site digesters that meet, or I guess that are not part of the exclusions from the compost regulations that were posted last year. So like we were talking about earlier, the recyclable and compostable material or composted material would have to be reported to CalRecycle for the tons and the material types sent to each receiver, and the receiver can be any number of entities. And for the residuals and whatever else may be sent to disposal, that would just be the total tons sent to each disposal facility by their jurisdiction of origin and their source sector. Generally, a recycler and a composter, if they're a generally clean operation and have less than 10% of residuals, they're not going to have to report the jurisdiction of origin and the source sector, but they still will have to report the total tons of their residual. So just making sure there that if someone who takes a majority of recyclable materials but still has a substantial residual, they would still have to report jurisdiction of origin. And in that case, we are setting the threshold at 100 tons per month and more than 10% of the residuals in order to have to report the jurisdiction of origin and the source sector for the residuals. So the recyclers and composters would just send that information. Usually it would be just the tons per material type to each receiver to CalRecycle. And in the special circumstances that we discussed, that being sending over 100 tons per month and over 10% of residuals to disposal, then in that case, they would also have to send source sector and jurisdiction of origin information. So the 100 tons and 10% is a number that we put up there, but we would like some feedback from you guys on whether or not you think that's a good number, if it's reflective of true situations that you see out in the field, as the conditions to trigger the reporting of jurisdiction of origin and source sector. Now remember, all recyclers are still going to have to report the total tons of their residual, but these conditions would just trigger whether or not they have to report jurisdiction of origin and source sector. As far as shipments to end users that are small, we're allowing shipments of less than 1 ton to end users as not having to report each person. So for example, if you have a compost operation that sends less than 1 ton, or someone comes by with their pickup truck and goes and spreads compost on their land or on their garden, we don't need everyone's name and address, right? So we just want to capture the larger players and not have kind of the mom and pop applications have to be reported. And so one of our questions here is 1 ton good enough, or is that not going to capture all of the mom and pop operations? Is there a different threshold for farms or other users that are not kind of industrial scale users? So that's another question that we have for you there. How much of this information must be provided for the people that are considered end users? So with that, we can take any questions in the room.
And I'll just add, while people think of questions, that the condition that triggers the reporting of the jurisdiction of origin and source sector, we're assuming that most recyclers and composters are not going to have to report this. But this is to sort of close a loophole preemptively, so that if you're a recycler or a composter who is sort of acting like a MRF, because of the amount of residuals or contamination that you're receiving into your facility, and you're diverting a lot of material to disposal, that material should be accurately reflected or assigned to the jurisdiction where it came from. So again, we pretty much expect most of these recycling and composting operations to not have to report this. It'll just be sort of the fringe facilities that are taking particularly contaminated material.
We have a question?
Tom Davis. On one of the slides that was just shown, it highlighted C&D. I want to go back to 2002, my previous comments on Article 5.95, which was Phase 2 of that package. Phase 1 of that package was 5.90, that has to do with the processing and the holding and handling and transporting of C&D and inert debris and all that kind of stuff. The term that was used in the slide is C&D. C&D is a very, very broad definition, okay? Not to belabor and take a lot of your time, but C&D can include components of building and structure, which should include lumber, wood, gypsum, wallboard, glass, metal, roofing material, tile, carpeting, tools, leftover, truck equipment leftover, blueprints, plans, other similar waste, so on and so forth. That's very, very broad. As Article 5.95 set IDEFOs to on a pedestal of higher distinction, Article 5.9 did the same thing for inert debris recycling facilities or centers, as defined in the regulations. These regulations referred to in 5.9, by the way, is referred to construction and demolition and inert debris transfer processing regulatory requirements, and the definition that I just gave you for C&D material came from that. There's several activities that are not subject to these regulations found in 5.9. One of them is inert debris recycling facilities, okay? These are facilities that bring in source-separated concrete and asphalt, homogeneous material, very similar to the virgin material, and is processed at these recycling centers, recycled, if you will, into an end product that meets a specification either set forth by Caltrans regulations or the Green Book. That material is often known as road-based, construction, miscellaneous base, so on and so forth. This material, if you were a contractor and you wanted a small amount of this final product, you could go to Home Depot and buy it in a bag or a big bulk bag that you would have lifted in the back of your pickup. But if you had a larger job where you needed more material, you would go to an inert debris recycling center and get a bunch more in a bigger truck. So, having said that, I would like to offer that inert debris recycling centers are end users and are not subject to these regulations.
So thank you for bringing up that point again. I think that we do need to consider the existing regulations and think about C&D a little bit more than we have, because they are a special case. However, I see that a lot of similarities between C&D and, say, like a compost facility that may be receiving a homogeneous mixture of like yard waste, for example, and then they may chip it or they may cure it and do some level of processing to it in order for it to become an end product that is then applied. So if that is a parallel type of structure, and I'm understanding your business model correctly, I think our regulations would still consider that to be a recycler. And that really doesn't overlap much with the permitting. The permitting process is a standalone process that has different requirements. And we are requiring reporting from entities that don't currently have permits or may not have permits or don't have to have permits. So whether or not it is permitted or not is not going to affect whether or not we are going to consider them as a processor or recycler for the purposes of reporting. And again, you would only have to report whatever is leaving your facility and what material type it is by tons.
And by person,
I'm sorry?
and by person.
And for each, for each receiver.
Yeah, I think
But
the,
in the case that you have, and this is, this is a threshold that we're still working on, but we want to be able to exclude those kind of small end users that are only going to be using a truckload, right, of material. We don't want everyone's name that came to your facility and picked up a truckload.
they went to Home Depot and picked it up instead?
Right, we don't want to know that, but we probably want to know how much you sold to Home Depot. We probably want to know if you sold 100 tons.
We don't sell it to Home Depot because we're the end user, and we sell it to the same people that Home Depot sells it to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think a worthwhile point that we would love to know from you is what that threshold is. What is a small user that we could just aggregate and say, small users used 1,000 tons this quarter? And what's going to be kind of the more industrial scale use, just so that we can know the difference between those two. So I think we would really love to hear what your opinion is on what that threshold is for considering small users of the C&D materials. So we'd love to get an email from you with that.
You certainly will.
Great.
And addressing that, why in the heck do you need to know by name and presumably location each receiver of each ton and type of material that comes out of one of these facilities?
Well, one of the reasons that we would like to know that is because we don't want you or any other processor to have to make assumptions about the person that they're sending it to, right? It shouldn't be your responsibility to discern whether the person you're sending it to is an end user or not. Whether if they are receiving it and then they're doing some additional processing to it and then passing it along in the chain of the materials for use. So we saw this as a way for CalRecycle to be able to determine whether or not those are end users in fact, or if there's additional processing being done. If we were to get an aggregate report of you saying we sent out all of our material to end users, then we'd be like, great, we know that, but now we have no avenue of verifying that they indeed are end users. So I think it's one way for us to know if there are additional reporting entities that we would have to add to the reporting system if they are continuing to utilize the material and say adding more value to it by processing it in a new, a different way.
And
So
I'll
the
add-
question is, the material that, the person that would come and take material out of, from a finished product, come out of inert debris recycling center, the question is that person a person or an end user? Am I getting that right?
Right.
Okay, so why do we need to know this? How does that wrap back to the whole intent of meeting a 75% recycling or a reduction of waste flow into landfills by 2020? How does that, what does this information do? How does this information help? And you got to remember, this is information we don't necessarily keep. And there's going to be a great expense for gathering this information and reporting it. And it would be terrible if anyone in this room representing these industries in this room are going to all of this expense and it really doesn't benefit what we're trying to do.
Sure, and I would say that we still, like we mentioned before, we still need to think more about C&D because it is different. So I would invite you to have that conversation with us to see if the material that you're putting out doesn't have any other kind of application that could be used other than the end use, then perhaps it would be safe to assume that this kind of material is intended for that end use, and then we could make a provision for that. So I would invite that conversation.
And I'll add, just to touch on a couple of the points that I think I heard you say earlier, that we're not looking for the name of every small user. Small users, we don't want to know. Where that threshold is, like Alanka said, we're still working on figuring out how to draw that line, but we don't need to know that. processors who send material off in large quantities, we need to know where they're going because we need to identify whether that is a reporting entity or not. And if we can step away just a moment from aggregate and C&D and all of this for a moment, for a different example, say you're a chip and grinder of organics and you chip wood waste and you send it off to somebody. Now that could be used as an end use, right, as mulch. Somebody could just put it down as mulch, or they could put it into a compost facility or a digester or some other operation that is processing that further. Now, you as a chip and grinder, how do you know what they're going to do with it, right? You sell it to them, they could do whatever they want with it. It's not your responsibility to identify their intentions for that material. So you just tell us where it goes, and then we reach out and ask that facility, we have record that you received 1,000 tons of chipped organic materials. We think you might be a reporting entity. What did you do with that material? And if they say, well, we applied it as mulch, we were an end user, then we're done. We don't get any information. But if they say we mixed it in with our compost and we composted all this material, well, now they are a legitimate reporting entity and they have to report to us. So we go out and we identify them that way. And to answer your question about why we need this information, understanding the flow of material and how materials, recyclable, compostable, or solid waste move through the system throughout California is really the only way that we can understand what's going on so that we can identify areas that need additional assistance or improvement that we can interfere in somehow and help either bolster up a weak spot or try to help add additional infrastructure or identify where the system is not working optimally to get us to that 75% goal or some of our other policy goals. So really that's why we need the information, because without information, we're kind of just guessing about what to do in this area. And so we need to get a better handle on what's going on so that we can allocate our resources more effectively.
Okay, potentially the last comment. If we do have to report end users by name, ton and type of material, why do we have to do it for individual end users? If you go back to AB 901, it says that it would like to have this information for end users, not each end user. So it would simplify things if we had to report end users, that we say, okay, so many tons of this type of material went to end users, period. That's all that is required by AB 901. It does not say that you have to break it down to each and every Joe Blow that buys your material. Given, yes, there's a threshold, I understand. But even if there's a threshold, there may be hundreds of thousands of folks that are above that are end users. And there's no need to know who they are individually. So with that, food for thought.
Hi, I'm David Crone. I'm a professor at University of California, Riverside. I do a lot of work, research supporting the compost industry, and I have some questions about the compost components of this, and a couple of suggestions. Well, first of all, the 1 ton question, is that a good number? And in most of the materials management, hauling operations, those sorts of things, you have a scale, and so weight basis really makes sense. But in marketing bulk materials, they're typically marketed on a volume basis because they have front-end loaders that scoop them up, and it's usually marketed by the cubic yard. So I would think about doing it in terms of volume. That has the additional advantage of you have a number then that's not going to be swayed by moisture conditions. So that's.
Thank you.
Second, in item 27, there are categories that include organics, again, limiting myself to compost, mixed compostable materials with less than 10% residual non-recyclable materials, and then similar materials greater than 10%. How do you distinguish organics from mixed recyclable materials less than 10% residuals?
I think we would have two different categories. There will be mixed recyclables and the other being mixed compostables. So depending on the level of contamination that is leaving the facility, that is what would determine what material type you report. So say you're a compost facility and you take in yard waste and food waste. You don't have to report any contamination coming into your facility. You only have to report what's coming out.
Right.
So if if you take your residuals out and that has a bunch of compostable material in it and you're sending that maybe for further processing, then you would report that as mixed compostable material. And if it's sent to disposal, then you wouldn't have to report material type.
Well, I
You
may
would
be
just have
missing
to
something,
report
but
total tons.
what's the difference between organics as a category and mixed compostables? Maybe you just answered it, but I didn't get it.
So the material categories is just to let people know what they have to report on. So we're
Okay.
by saying material category, the definition says is the kind of material that you must report. So we're listing these things here just to say, if you handle any paper, you have to report it. If you handle any organics, you have to report it. If
So-
you handle mixed recyclables or mixed organics or solid waste, you have to report it.
And I'll add that this was sort of an opportunity for us to add a little bit of clarity. Maybe a strict reading would say that you don't necessarily have to include that as another example. But there was some concern about what do I do as a facility if I'm kind of sending some mixture of stuff that's not really all paper or plastic or recyclables or compostable, but it's kind of just a mix. And we want to be able to provide an opportunity for those facilities that are sending material like that out to be able to report it in a way that represents that sort of mixed nature of the material, rather than trying to tease out, it's probably 20% wood and 5% food and 13% plastic and 24% paper, et cetera. So that would be the reasoning for that. We added it to try to add a little bit more clarity. Perhaps it didn't do that, and maybe there's a better place to put that. But that was the intent, was to add the capacity for people to report out as a mixed category rather than trying to tease out specific types.
Okay, well, as you're bouncing down into your appropriate pachinko slot at the bottom, it's hard to tell which of those would apply to compost materials. Most of us would say organics, but for example, you list soil as an inert, so it has its own identity. Most compost products would have more than 10% soil. And so that would put them under, a material greater than 10% impurities or whatever it is. My phone just went black. But it just needs a little bit of clarity there. I had one other thing. Nope, I got them all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ben Barker, Sewing Miller Contracting. Going back to the idea of tracking the waste, it's very simple to look at the output that we have to tell what's going on. We want to recycle more material. We recycle, for instance, with Caltrans, the most recycled material we can put in our mix in asphalt is 15%. The city of Los Angeles for 20 years has been putting 50%. We both build roads. The economic models are what drives how you use recycle or not. It's more economical to use recycle than virgin. You've already put the oil in the rocks. You're reclaiming that and you're putting it back in new roads. Because of specification limitations, we can't put more recycled material in our new product or the product we send out. So rather than trying to focus on where the stuff is coming from, focus on how it's been going to be used. Help us sell recycled stuff rather than burden us with tracking how it's getting to us. Same thing for the recycled product. We're forced to take up and show how much we're recycling from a lot of cities, and then they won't let us put crushed miscellaneous waste back down on their job. We have to use virgin material. So if we focus on the specifications, rather than how this stuff is flowing, we'll achieve more recycling and we'll be better off with less record keeping.
Thank you. So I think there's, for this particular question, much of what you were describing was what would an end user of the material would be doing with it, which would be outside of the reporting world for 901. So if you're mixing a blend and it's 15% or 50% recycled, that's all sort of in the realm of end user and therefore not reported. It would be, the reporting entity would be the entity that is creating the recycled portion of that blend. So if you're crushing it up and selling that on or passing it on to somebody who will then blend it into some usable product, the step before the blending would be the last reporting entity. And so we wouldn't be requiring a particular blending operation or a construction operation to report how much of their blend is recycled versus not recycled. And that wouldn't come into play for any of this sort of contamination question. So those groups would be out as far as 901 goes.
I hear what you're saying, but the goal is to meet 75% not going to landfills. It seems like we're jumping over that and saying that we're not going to require end users to use more recycled material.
Right, and I think that's a separate sort of policy question. We do have other policy initiatives that attempt to try to drive the markets for recycled content products. We have a division that focuses a lot on trying to develop markets for recycled content materials in the private sort of industry. And also we have our state agency Buy Recycle program, which tries to incentivize and require state agencies, California state agencies, to purchase and use certain percentages of recycled content material in an effort to drive the markets. And that's certainly a very important piece of the overall puzzle. It's not specifically what we're doing here with 901 reporting, but it is something that we are engaged in elsewhere at CalRecycle, and it's admittedly a very important piece of the overall strategy. And I don't know, Christine, if you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I think Robert very much summarized it. I mean, again, I think what you're saying, we would really love to engage and do further, but for purposes of this discussion, it is limited just to the data reporting and getting CalRecycle the data that is useful for us to have more of these conversations in targeted markets and specific material types. And again, as this information will also be helpful as when we do waste characterization studies to see where do we still need work on. And so very much appreciate your comments about how do we get some more of those end users and end markets to help us meet our goals. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Dan Noble, Association of Compost Producers. I have a number of questions. You mentioned a list of targeted materials. Is such a list exist? It's not part of the draft regulations, is it? Or where is that?
I think it's under material type.
Is that one of the definitions?
Or, no, it's under targeted materials. It should be in the definitions. It's under material categories.
Yeah, it's definition number 27,
So that's the one
subsection
that David was just talking
G.
about.
Yeah, 27G.
So that's what you were referring to in terms of targeted materials.
Yeah, and that includes carpet, mattresses, white goods, furniture, electronics, textiles, household batteries, architectural paint, and used tires.
Oh, I see. Those are a special subcategory of the target. Okay, thank you. I heard some things here today and some questions with some of my colleagues in the room that all of a sudden became very troubling to me, and it's like exploded this whole discussion. It has to do with haulers and brokers around the recycler composter category, which is what we're talking about here.
We do have a section right after this one that's just going to be on brokers and transporters.
Right, but I want to make sure that, because we work with composters who produce and market compost, but also many of our members are have chip and grind operations on site and sell the material uncomposted off-site. So we already talked a little bit about that, but we have very few of our members who are only chip and grinders. And from what we understand from very anecdotal evidence, and I don't know how you're going to capture this in this endeavor, but the chip and grind operations that exist all throughout the state, but especially in Southern California, that do chip and grinding and are not regulated and do, I know who some of them are anecdotally. They may provide playground chips or, and then when you were saying in the haulers that the landscapers who actually collect the organic material, many of them chip it, like there's huge operations that work for the utilities. One company that comes to mind is Asplund, that has a whole fleet of trucks and chippers on the back of those trucks. And they go out to burn areas and chip, hundreds of thousands of tons of material and then deposit it either in the forest or take it to energy facilities or any of that. And those currently are not in the current solid waste system, but under 901, it sounds like they would be classified as haulers.
They would be classified as chip and grinders. They're classified as organics recyclers.
Okay, so they would be in this category anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and that's, okay, so we're talking about doing a census, in essence, on a quarterly basis of anybody who has anything to do with more than 10 tons per quarter of organics materials. Is that true?
That's what we're hoping.
Yeah. Have you done a cost-benefit analysis of that information gathering?
Again,
terms
this is just the informal workshop, so we're that will be a part of definitely the formal rulemaking process.
Yeah, but might that be a little
So
too
is your
late?
question whether not the 10 ton is an appropriate threshold for chip and grind given their business model?
Well, every landscaper that I know of, for the most part, more bigger than 2 people, will handle more than 10 tons of organic material in a 1 month, in a 1 quarter. Okay, that's what you're talking about here. So that means that you're going to now require every landscaper of any size, more than just a few people, to report to CalRecycle where all those organics are going.
Well, we're still open to discussing that number, and we may have to have a different number for that de minimis for organics as opposed to recycling. So we would, we're not operators, right? So we don't know what the day-to-day operations looks like.
Well-
So I think we would really welcome that information from the industry.
Yeah.
So what is an appropriate cutoff level for that?
There's kind of 2 questions there, though. One is a census, and the other one, from a marketer's perspective, is a sample. We do a census every 10 years of the total population, and then we model the population changes based on, special algorithms. And in marketing, generally, you don't do a census of your entire market. You don't poll 100% of the people who are buying product or that you're selling product to. You do maybe a 5 or 10% sample, and you do a statistical sample across all ranges of buyers, whether it's, in this case, whether it's 1 ton or 100 tons.
Yeah, so I'll add a few things. First, I would say generally the world of organics has some special considerations that don't always line up well with the traditional recyclables markets. And so we've taken some attempt to try and carve out special situations for them as we knew them. This might be another one. What I would see is the landscaper who has a small chipper on the back of his truck. That would, in my view, be considered a hauler. And so for the most part, not have to report. But if
They
you're,
would report if they were not sending it, if they were sending it to, I mean, they have to report if they don't send it to a facility. What I
That's
was
right.
seeing in here is they have to report if they're sending it to an end user, and many of them will send it to an end user. The facility who receives it from them, basically another green distributor, which I would, depending on whether they're composting it or whether they're brokering it, they might take it to a green yard and broker it. Then that waste recycler would, I don't know if they'd be treated as a recycler or a broker,
Yeah.
rather than an end user.
probably, so they would probably be treated as a broker or a processor, depending on what they're doing. Our intention is not to have everybody with a pickup truck and a small chipper
No, I get
report.
that, but we're not, most landscapers who, if they have enough to buy a Vermeer chipper, I don't know if you've ever purchased one, but if they're big enough to buy one of those chippers that's on the back of a truck, just one landscape operation, they'll fill that truck up with 10 tons just right there, or maybe 5 tons. But that's just one client, okay? So they will be, and then they may take that material over to another spreading yard or to another, combiner. So I'm just trying to figure out how you're gonna find all these people and who's gonna have to report, and whether the composters who are receiving the material, I understand if they're receiving the material, they're going to have to report on the material that they're sending out, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so I'm not having as much problem with the composters as I am with all of the other entities that don't go to compost facilities. Except for those entities that send large amounts of materials or even relatively small amounts of materials to people who use that compost but don't use it directly on their own property, whether they would be classified as end users or brokers. So for example, in the example that I was using, that one of our largest companies in the industry is a retail compost producer, basically a bagging and retail distributor. Under these regulations, or under these reporting rules, regulations, would be classified, I think, as a broker, not as an end user.
Probably,
Yeah.
yes.
So that means that broker who's doing, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of tons they're doing, is, getting bagged and sent to the big box stores. The big box stores would be considered end users, but really they're brokers too, under this same model. So that if somebody came in and bought more than a ton of material, or even 10 tons of material from them, because you can see how kind of complicated this is getting. Especially if you're trying to get 100% of the information from everybody that's touching these materials, rather than, say, doing a sampling, which to me would be a lot less costly to the industry and still fulfill your objectives at CalRecycle.
Yeah, so for the most part, the huge number of entities that might be handling materials, those for the most part are ones that we want to exclude. In your example, that big mulch yard that's acting basically like a broker, everybody who brings material to that broker would be a hauler that has no reporting requirements, because they're taking it to a reporting entity at this broker facility.
So you'd have to find who those yards are.
That's right.
Now, how about the one that is just, say, taking the chip and grind material from one landscape and putting it, maybe they're storing it on their own yard. And I know many landscape companies that do this. They have 5-acre yards where they take they aggregate all of their landscape material, and then, when the time is right, they'll sell it to, say, Caltrans, and they'll take, tons of material over to Caltrans. So the landscaper who's doing that would be, in essence, their own broker, right?
Right, or consider it as a processor. That situation is exactly why we need sort of a good threshold number, because we want to be able to capture the ones that are handling significant quantities of material that we want to know about, compared to very small operations that are handling relatively insignificant amounts of material in the grand scheme of things. We don't want to miss out on 150,000 tons of wood waste just because it's being it's being handled by a handful of operators. On the same token, we don't need to know every tree that gets chipped in the state. That would be far too much information that we would never be able to make use of. So there is finding a balance there. And as we mentioned, the threshold that might make sense for plastics and metals and papers might not necessarily make so much sense when we move into the world of organics. And so we might have to have a split threshold, one that applies to your standard commodity recyclables and another one that applies to organics. And we don't know exactly what the best number is for that, but hearing some of the conversation that we've had here today, as well as some of what we've heard at previous workshops, we're starting to get a better sense of where some of those numbers might seem more realistic, but we're not there all the way. So any thoughts on how these operations are working? How much typically do these yards, landscapers' yards, accumulate before they sell it? Is it 100 or 500 or 10,000 tons of material before they sell it to a Caltrans or somewhere else? Knowing how those operations work will help us understand where to draw the line so that it makes sense for us gathering information as well as for the industry that's being asked to report that information.
Yeah, well, without us doing a separate market analysis on our own dime, the best we can do is give you a best guess, but I would argue with my membership to do a sample, not a census, just because of the continuing ongoing data gathering that this is requiring that hasn't been done before. So, but we'll see. We'll just have to see where this goes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Tony Grosso with the California Asphalt Pavement Association. I understand the intent of what we're doing here, and AB 901 is to have a better information collection to hopefully demonstrate that by 2020, you're hitting the 75% mark. The regulation goes into effect, you start collecting data in 2018. What happens if you don't get there? What's the end point other than having better information to know whether you're recycling? So the follow-up to that is a follow-up to Mr. Barker's comments that companies are collecting reclaimed asphalt, for example, to put back into the product. The biggest user of asphalt products is the State of California Department of Transportation, which is the most hesitant to put a higher percentage that we're seeing like LA County and others do. So as a parallel discussion to once we're collecting data, the state departments are putting the contractor in the middle of a regulation to try to push more recycled material and collect the data on it, and then another department that's resistant to it. So the discussion has to happen at the state level. How do we better recycle materials and not put them back into landfills and not fight each other? And yet the contractors and the companies like Mr. Barker's company and the members that I represent with the California Asphalt Pavement Association are caught at that. So they're going to go through a lot of effort to try to collect data for you in this 901 process that may or may not do anything to meet your goal. So that's just a comment there. And a little bit of a comment from the gentleman before us. All of this impact, what is the cost-benefit analysis that goes on to what the companies are going to have to go through to report, and yet at the end of the day, what do we get out of it? So just for the sake of comment, those are things that have to be considered. With every new regulation that goes out there, it is greater burden on the companies to provide information that what do we do with it when we've collected it.
And I think the main goal of having this information, of course, is to see if we're meeting our mandates, but more importantly than that is what do we need to do next? And you can't, there's a saying from, I heard a while ago, you can't manage what you don't measure, right? So in the state of California, we get very little information about what's actually being recycled. Most of the information, we have pretty good information on what's being disposed, and that's basically what we've based our recycling rates on so far. So knowing better how we are recycling and what we're not doing is going to arm us with the information that we need to approach other state agencies, to maybe approach your state representatives and say, look, we have this information. We know we're not doing as well as we could be. And these are ways that we can remediate that. And so having that information then provides you the tools to build better programs. And that is what CalRecycle's job is to help the state of California to recycle. And this information is going to be really important in guiding us on how we're going to do that.
And you're collecting the data, I'm sure, in another manner, but legislative mandates that are then put out and then not pushed forward by the departments, such as the Department of Transportation. We're seeing this in the tire rubber collection too. The landfills are collecting tires. We're trying to put it back into the product, and you're collecting them at a greater rate than any of the departments will allow us to put it back into the product. So there's issues that come along with that as well. But anyhow, just to point, I understand what you're trying to do here, but to Mr. Barker's comments, there are other pushbacks that industry is fighting to try to comply with what your overall intent is. So anyhow, thank you.
Thank you.
I did have a third point.
Welcome back.
Thank you. David Crone. This is going to be a really important database for more than just CalRecycle's purposes. And so I'm going to speak toward the confidentiality rule, which I strongly agree with. I think people who are submitting this information need to know that it's not going to affect their competitive position or their privacy. On the other hand, the data that's going to be generated, particularly with respect to land application of organics, that's something that needs to be managed. It has groundwater quality implications, salinity, air quality, carbon sequestration, transport of pests, all sorts of issues that this may inform on. And so I would urge you to have a mechanism by which scholars, other researchers can come in and have access to this information while making sure that any information that's released is protecting the privacy of the people who contributed it.
Thank you.
My name's Paul Ryan. I'm representing the Inland Empire Disposal Association today. The one thing that was brought up by the construction and demolition industry and in reference to Caltrans and some of the other state agencies. As you develop these regulations and also the databases, one of the things that I want to make clear to you is that you have a responsibility going back to, I think, 2006 to implement the Buy Recycled program with the state agencies. In the work I do on AB 939 compliance, including looking at the SB 75 reporting and so forth, it's pretty sad the paltry level of recycling that the state agencies do. As part of what you're doing, you need to step up to the plate and insist that the state agencies accept the responsibility for what they are mandated to do, and just don't punish industry for things that you guys need to do. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We definitely agree with the purchasing power of the state and the department's 75% report that was released last year. That was definitely one of the strategies for meeting 75%. And as I believe Robert mentioned, we do have a unit that is focused on that, and certainly we can always work to do more and welcome further conversations on that.
We have one online question. We have a POTW in our jurisdiction that generates digestate and compostate with horse bedding from offsite and then piles up the compost for community access for free. Would they be reporting on this material flow in any way? So there is provisions in the compost regulations, that's section 17.855, that say that temporary storage of biosolids at POTWs are exempted, but it sounds like when you're bringing in materials from off-site and then providing that material to the public, I would think that that would consider or consist of a reporting entity that would have to report the outbound flow, just like any other composting operation. So that's the last question I have for this section online, and I don't see any other questions in the room, so we're going to move forward to transporters and brokers. So transporters and brokers are a category of people that may or may not have to report depending on the situation. So we're calling this whether someone takes physical or legal possession of the material. So a broker or a transporter would have to report only if a MRF or processor sells it or passes the ownership of the material to the broker and doesn't really know what's going to happen to it after that. But if the broker arranges a sale, but a MRF or transfer station or processor fulfills that sale and knows therefore where it would be going, then it would be the responsibility of the MRF to report that transaction. Here we want to try to avoid the reporting of a single shipment by more than one entity. So we recognize that this is going to be challenging, but hopefully we can work out these bugs. But so for the recyclable and compostable material or compost, a broker or transporter would have to report the tons of material types sent to each receiver or exported. So this it's a pretty simple flowchart. They just tell us. And there it goes. So reminding us again that transporters are those that haul from a reporting entity, not from generators. And that transporters and brokers don't have to report to CalRecycle if the sending facility has already reported that material. If the facility has transferred the material to a broker and they don't know where it's going, then they would just tell CalRecycle that they gave this material to that person, and then CalRecycle can follow up on that person to make sure that that we know where the material has ultimately ended up. If the transporter or broker is transporting mixed solid waste, then we would still require the jurisdiction of origin and source sector for that material, just like we would anyone else. So with that, I will take questions in the room on this section.
I'll just add a little bit of clarity on that last bullet, what the reasoning was for that. If you're a facility, particularly if you're sending it out of the state to its final destination, it may be sent out as quote-unquote mixed recyclables to a MRF that's out of state, but since we won't get any information from that out-of-state facility, you may be sending material that's mostly solid waste, that's 40, 50, 60% solid waste and just a small amount of recyclables. So there could be a very significant amount of solid waste for which the jurisdiction of origin will be lost. And so this is a mechanism for us to capture that information before it sort of disappears. So that's what this last bullet was meant to do. And with that, we can move on to the question.
Tom Davis, this is a quick one. A couple of the slides that you've shown us has used the term receiver. A receiver I can't find being defined in the draft regulations. Are we to assume
You can consider that to be a receiving person, so it would just be any entity under the definition of person.
Okay, so it's the same, interchangeable, okay.
That was easy. You gave us an easy question this time.
Well, I can make something else up.
Any other questions? No? All right. So we're going to let Paulina tell us about the enforcement now.
Good afternoon, everyone. As part of this new piece of legislation, as mentioned before, which wasn't always included previously in the DRS regs, there is a portion for enforcement. The enforcement piece is pretty much outlined within the legislation itself, and so the draft regulations actually kind of pull from that piece to begin with. The notice of violation that is mentioned is for any of those entities that do not report accordingly to the department. We would then actually give them a notice of violation, a chance to remedy those violations with a deadline. And if those remedies are not, are not complied with by that deadline, then penalties will be imposed. And as noted in the draft regulations, we do have a penalty chart. So that's what we would go off of in terms of depending on what penalties would be assessed to the entity itself who is not reporting to the department. Now, the department will consider whether the violation was intentional. And we're not looking at clerical errors. We're looking at some entity that will repeatedly, not provide the information as requested, or repeatedly do multiple sets of clerical errors, which would then be assessed by the department at that time. We'll also then, and in that part, it would be considered like the history of a non-compliance of that entity and also the gravity of that violation. Now, violations will include basically failure or refusal to submit information on time, the willful falsification of reports of records, or refusal of inspection of those reports. And lastly, failure to keep reports themselves. As noted, we are more than willing to work with each and every entity to answer any questions and to hopefully remedy and help those entities comply with the AB 901 enforcement piece. Are there any questions? Oh, thank you, Alonka.
Whence? I have to find it.
It'll be just a few minutes.
Okay, here we go. How do we deal with enforcement if haulers are not required to report directly to CalRecycle? Are the facilities expected to advise CalRecycle each and every time a hauler comes to their facility and does not submit the required reports, or the reports are submitted late, incomplete, or inaccurate? If so, what evidence, if so, what evidence would be required to impose penalties, and how long would that process take? This seems to be a real potential problem in the reporting system design for a number of potential reasons, which need to be addressed to avoid misreporting source of origin and sector.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question, and there's multiple pieces to it, so I'll try and answer what I can hopefully answer. There's a lot of things that still need to be determined in terms of length and time of enforcement. The initial part is when you have a reporting hauler that does not provide you that information, that would be something that would have to be reported to us and let us know, in terms of why you could not get that information. We would then kind of take that into consideration as in terms of a compliance timeline or as a notice of violation. We cannot, there is not a way to really penalize those facilities that cannot get information from people who should be reporting to them. So at that point in time, we would need to be advised of that, and then we would work with that entity appropriately. And I think I missed one or two other questions within that.
I think you got all of them.
Okay. And if you do have more questions to the person online, please feel free to email that, and we will be happy to work with you on that, to answer that. Yes, sir.
My name is Carlos Ruiz. I'm a processor CRV as well as a hauler recycler.
Okay.
Cardboard. Cardboard is an industry in that there are very large volume of small mom and pop recyclers who will do 10, 20 tons a month. That's their living. These individuals can take it to a recycler or they can take it to an end user. How are you going to track these individuals who basically operate whenever they want to operate? I mean, they may want to operate a whole month, do a lot of volume. Next month, they're going to take the month off. They're not going to do anything with that time. These individuals have a choice. Who's paying them the most money? They can take it to an end user. They don't have to report anything. They can take it to a recycler. Obviously, the recycler is now going to ask them, who are you? Where you came from? Blah, blah, blah. How are you going to enforce these individuals? These individuals are, for the most part, I use the word pirate in the sense that they're picking up cardboard from dumpsters all over in pickup trucks and taking them to facilities.
So maybe I'll step in first because I think it has a little bit more to do with an earlier section. So I think most of those cardboard haulers would probably fall into the category of a hauler, meaning they're picking up from the point of generation, whether it's in a dumpster or at a, behind a supermarket or wherever. So they're haulers, and they're bringing it almost never to an end user, probably almost always to some sort of a processor.
In the Inland Empire, there's some end users, but okay.
So they're just retaping the boxes and reusing them.
No, actually using it for a product that they make.
Okay, I mean, we can get into sort of the details. Sure. So yeah, if there were a small hauler carrying material directly to an end user that exceeded the thresholds of either the 10 tons per quarter or 1 ton per trip. So if they're taking more than 1 ton of cardboard directly to an end user, then in that case, they would end up, under the current writing of the regs, they would be a reporting entity. My understanding of the cardboard industry is that for the most part, they'll be taking them to processors. The cardboard will be taken to a processor, at which point the hauler doesn't have any reporting obligation to the processor. So they wouldn't be getting any of the name of the hauler or their address. They wouldn't be registering or reporting or anything, but the processor would be the one who is reporting. So all those little haulers would be out, not having to report. If there are some unique situations where there are sort of mid-size or small haulers that are taking directly to end users, that might be more of a discussion of thresholds of significance. I'm just not aware of the specific instances of directly hauling from a generator to an end user for cardboard, but like we said earlier, we don't know everything about the industry, so if you can let us know maybe a little bit more of the details via email or something offline, then we can look into it and see whether there's an adjustment to be made. Because no, we don't want everybody that has a pickup truck with those great big tall plywood sides that they're stacking cardboard up. Those aren't the folks that we want to be capturing in the reporting. So we just want to make sure that we're writing the regs appropriately to accommodate that. So thank you for that.
Okay. Separate question, horse bedding. I haul a lot of stables. I take the horse bedding to get mixed and make it into NFS, nitrolyzed fur shavings. But at times, my end user, we're not really an end user, they're really a processor, cannot take anymore. So I take it and dump it. So now I have the same commodity of which I may have 2 containers, 40 yards. One goes into a processing facility and the other one has to be taken to the landfill because the processing facility doesn't have the capacity anymore to handle on that specific day. Now, am I responsible to report the activity and the source of that material to two different situations?
So anybody who's recycling the material doesn't need to know source sector or jurisdiction of origin. That requirement is only for disposal.
Correct.
So if you have two containers and you're sending one to be recycled and one to be disposed, you only need to know the jurisdiction and source sector for disposal. And that information you would have to give to the landfill anyways, and the
Well, that's it.
landfill then reports that to us.
Okay.
But you
So
wouldn't,
in the case of horse bedding, source sector,
commercial?
is that considered a commercial? Okay.
Yeah, I think so, unless it's from private residences, which you probably aren't
Oh,
picking up.
I'm sure a lot of these are individuals who have their own personal horses, and I provide them a means for them to load it up into a 40-yarder and take it out. They have their own skip loaders, and they just load them up. I run a route.
Okay. Well, you can definitely email us and we can try to think about that situation and get back to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I think that in that situation, for the most part, if you make, if the landfill's asking you this question when you come to drop it off, you pull up and they say, what city are you from? And you tell them what city, and they say, where did this material come from, commercial or residential? If you know that it's all commercial, just say commercial, and if you know it's residential, say it's residential, and if it's a mix, say it's a mix, and it might be different every single time, and that's totally fine too.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. All right, we're getting towards the end of the day. We're nearly done, I promise. We're really just opening it up at this point for general questions and comments. That's some topics that we haven't touched on yet that you would still like to bring up. And then after this, we'll end with just our next steps moving forward. Okay. Well, seeing no one, I'm just going to move on to the last slide here. What's going to happen next? We'd like to have folks email your comments relatively quickly. If you have some placeholder comments and you need a little bit more time to get the details down, please send those to us too. We'll be taking these comments and these questions and using them to help revise the regulations and get a new set of draft regulations out. Like I said at the beginning, we're trying to determine at this point whether there's a need for another set of informal workshops, and we won't really know that until we understand the depth and breadth of the questions and comments on the current set. So we are asking for a fairly quick turnaround on getting comments in. The email address is there at the bottom, and it's been throughout the presentation. Please send them as soon as you can. If you have multiples that you need some time for some of them, please send us the first ones that you have at the top of your head, and then you can add more later on. That would be really helpful. Like I said, we'll review those questions and comments and revise the draft, try to answer as many concerns that we can, and ultimately begin the formal regulatory process. A specific date will be to be determined. With that being said, there's the contact information. You can contact me if you like, but really that shared 901 mailbox is the best way to go because multiple people monitor that, and we'll make sure that we get somebody to contact you. Yeah, can we?
Let's go back. There we go.
Great. And if you haven't already signed up for the listserv, please do. You'll get notified of updates. Looks like we've got another question or comment here.
Just a quick question. You've got the comments by a week from today. Even if we have further comments, we can go beyond that time?
Yeah, like I said, we're trying to push for as much as we can get early on, so that we can have a sense of what the nature of the comments are and how far-reaching they are. If you know you're going to have comments that you won't be able to get in by the 19th, let us know that you have comments so that we're not assuming that they're all in.
Yeah, the 19th is problematic, just considering the other things I've got on my schedule. So it would be very skeleton at this point.
And that would be certainly much more helpful than nothing at this point.
So I guess my point was, considering we've taken 6 months to get to this point, is there any problem with adding one more week to your deadline for your comments to the 26th.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd like to keep the request at the 19th for now, realizing that we will accept more detail beyond that. So yes, we can accept additional detail for the comments, but we would like at least a placeholder within the week.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you.
Mike Mahajer, LA County Task Force. As far as in reference to the deadline of the 17th, the task force is a brown body, and they meet only once a month. And so there's no way we can send comments by July 17. So for the records, we will be submitting comments, but it's going to be after the July 17 because of the Brown Act. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, seeing no more comments, I'd like to thank everybody so much for coming out, spending your time listening to us talk and providing your comments. Look forward to seeing all of your emails and written comments moving forward. Thanks so much.